Lilith Walton, beloved as the kindest princess across the kingdoms, was the radiant heart of a once glorious realm. At 22, her bright spirit and boundless compassion won her the admiration of all, her kindness matched only by her courage. But her generosity would be her undoing. In a cruel twist of fate, it led her into the grasp of a merciless beast, a creature far beyond human. Ragnar, a king no one had ever seen but was feared by the whole world. He lurked in the shadows of the night and feasted on his enemies. He was known as the cruelest king, and on one fortunate night he came across someone so opposite to his world. He was intrigued and obsessed with her. Fascinated by her purity, obsessed with her light, Ragnar will stop at nothing to claim her, to make her his. He yearns to possess her, claim her, and captivate her in every possible way he can, because little Lilith belongs to him. Book 2, Bride of Ice and Flame.
Want to win a free bundle of 3 amazing audiobooks? Comment Dark Fantasy below for a chance to win. No limit on entries. Comment as many times as you like. I will select 5 random comments. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for new books every weekend.
Prologue. What is it like when a bored yet malicious soul finds something new to feed on? Catastrophic. A powerful one could have the vision of conquering something. It could either be a kingdom to rule on, a thing to add to their possessions, or a person to prey on. A single blow against them either had them rattling down on the floor or prowling for their enemies with intensity and madness that was never seen in them before. Is it the pride that was hurt? Or just revenge? Nonetheless, once the enemies are under the claws, life becomes pretty boring and one becomes aimless. A beast dying to hunt comes across a wounded butterfly. One blow from him and it'd be nothing. Yet it flutters away with those broken wings and is so hard to hold on to. A new adventure for him. A disaster for her. Raking a hand through his long dark silver hair, he gazed at her with his orbs that resembled the moon, yet they weren't gentle or generous enough to shine upon you. Eyes of a predator gazing at its prey, prey of someone as disastrous as him. He kept swirling the wineglass in his hand. His eyes moved with her every action of greeting. That gentle smile that kissed her features. The soft, silky, and white fabric that kissed her dainty figure. Her eyes shined due to happiness, but were unable to hide that fear that resides in them at the same time. She was unable to hide the love and respect that she had for that man beside her. The one she was standing so close to. The one who now owned her. But she was his from the moment he set his eyes on her. No matter if she was in a wedding dress, no matter if she was happy with the one beside her. Because only he could hold on to her. Break her or fix her. All onto his mercy. Chapter 1. I will come for you, my butterfly. His tone was low. His words came out slowly as if he was trying to make her memorize each of his words. There was an evil glint in his eyes. An evil passion and desire that was ignited inside his orbs. It made her heart fall into the pit of her stomach as her orbs throbbed in pure terror. She felt an immense fear. The same feeling still rushes in her adrenaline whenever she recalls those moments, or whenever those moments, or even those 2 evil jades flash in her dreams and end up waking her up from her already messed up slumber. Gasping for air. Drenched in sweat. Pupils dilated and filled with terror. He left something on her permanently, and it was his. Terror. Oh my dear Lilith. Did you have that nightmare again? Lilith, who was currently sitting on her canopy master bed, gasping for air while rubbing her chest, was seen by her granny. The old, short, and chubby lady with a silver and black hair bun nicely resting on her head, grabbed her dress and rushed up to Lilith. She sat near the girl's leg, and peered at her with concern dancing in her blue orbs. Did you have the same nightmare again? The old lady asked, and Lilith nodded, slowly calming herself down. What about the potion the physician gave you? She asked the young lady, who was now looking much better than before. Lilith Draven, the princess of the now-fallen kingdom Draven had brown, silky, thick, long, and wavy hair. Her lashes were thin but long, and those hazel jades resembled nothing but a river of sweet honey that gleamed in the sun. Her skin was fair but not fair enough, or to be more precise, not pale enough according to the beauties in the kingdom. She was of an average height. Not tall enough for the beauties, and too tall for the shorties. She was a princess, who was now nothing but a statue for others to pity on. "Lilith, you have to look amazing today to greet all the guests, but look at those bags under your eyes," the old granny said, exaggerating the situation like her chest. "A little makeup would suffice," Lilith said bluntly while taking the blanket off of her figure, as she was now sitting on the bed with her legs down, ready to get up. "My dear, it's your wedding and you don't look happy," the old granny said while caressing Lilith's arm. The young girl closed her eyes and took a deep breath, before a smile appeared on her lips, and she turned her face towards the granny so she could have a look at her face. "I see, but you know, no one is forcing you." The old granny threw the nice and understanding granny card on the floor, after making her see the dark side of her people's future if she doesn't marry Jasper. Jasper was the one who gave them a shadow to reside beneath after the Draven kingdom was destroyed 2 years ago, and the few people who survived the catastrophe had nowhere to go, so he sent them help. Lilith, who was the only one left of the royal family, was leading the caravan morphed in ruins. Weakness and desperation led them here. The destruction of their kingdom startled many, and no one was ready to help them, thinking the disaster that fell on their kingdom might fall on them as well. The disaster was so huge, it left nothing but ruins and some fatal wounds in the hearts of those who survived. A point of unbearable suffering came that they wished they died that day as well. Jasper, who helped them when no one did, became a hero in her people's eyes. They almost started to worship him. When Lilith regained her strength, she decided to go back to her home along with her people, but no one stepped forward to go back with her. She was left alone. Still, she decided to go back, but Jasper held on to her and asked for her marriage then and there only. Unfortunately, this news ended up falling on the ears of her granny, who survived as well. She started to emotionally blackmail her. The old granny wanted nothing but good for Lilith. She wanted her to marry the young king and start a new life. Lilith agreed, because she believed she had no aim in her life. After marrying Jasper, her people and their unborn children would gain the kingdom's name and would not be called outcasts in order to be identified. Thus they got engaged a year ago. And a few days later was their wedding. Lilith liked Jasper, but it was nothing more than liking. He has told her once and many more times before, without any reluctance, that he only liked Lilith's beauty, and that she was from a strong bloodline. There was no such thing as love, but just his attraction for her beauty. Today he liked her for her beauty. The next day he would like someone else. The problem was, he didn't love her but treated her like he loved her. At first, she thought he was showing it to others, but he was often the same with her when they were alone on the main terrace. She wanted nothing but a happy life, because this was the only thing that might set her free from the strings that attached her to her ruined kingdom. Only if she knew her kindness would lead to such destruction, she would be better off being rude. Now, she was truly looking forward to this marriage. Jasper liked her and respected her. That was enough for her. "I'm looking forward to a bright future," Lilith said and abruptly stood up. "Let's get ready. We must greet the guests," she said with a wide smile on her face. Little did she know, the bright future she was looking forward to would be even darker than her past. The monster was about to arrive. Chapter 2. The kingdom was blooming in happiness. Every other street was filled with chatters of excited people. Some were happy to know that their king was finally having his queen, and some were happy to know that their princess was finally marrying King Jasper of the Logon Kingdom. The castle was bustling with maids and servants running here and there, whispering the romance of the new couple in each other's ears while giggling and blushing. The romance that took place in their imaginations. The arrangements were in full swing for the upcoming grand wedding that was to take place in a week. The guests already started to bless the kingdom with their presence. The bride, Lilith, who was currently standing in the middle of the hall, donning a dark green velvety dress that fitted perfectly on her upper body and was floral from down, was greeting the guest with a warm smile on her face. She knew most of them, and fortunately, none of them was passing her sympathetic look. They looked delighted. A few guests she didn't know were introduced to her by the butler of the castle, who was standing right beside her. The butler wasn't a woman or an old man. It, maybe not so surprisingly, was a young man with long black hair. "We are pleased to have you here," Lilith said genuinely, and the guest passed her a warm smile, eyed her from head to toe, complimented her, and was taken away by the guards to show them around. Lilith took a deep and heavy breath. Some of them looked like pretenders. The way they eyed her and then complimented her, it was as if they were mocking Jasper for marrying someone as average-looking as her. They have been treating her low ever since she lost her kingdom. Pivoting on her heels, she began to walk away when she was done greeting all the guests. The servants and maids bowed at her while passing by her. She paid no heed to them or their silly talks until something unconsciously fell on her ears, which she didn't pay attention to either. The maids were talking about a guest. They were squealing in happiness. "You saw how tall he was? Oh my lord, that body was of a Greek god." Maid 1. Yeah, I almost slipped after seeing him." Maid 2. Both of them giggled and wandered away. Lilith took a turn to take a different path, and instantly halted on her steps when she saw her granny instructing the maids on what to do. Her heart almost leapt to her mouth. Before she could get caught by her, she slowly turned around and scooted away from there, taking another path. With a low huff, she shook her head and looked back to see if she was caught and if the granny was tailing her, but fortunately she wasn't. With a little grin plastered on her soft features, she turned around, and before she could even take a step further, she bumped into something so hard almost broke her nose and went blank for a second. The colliding impact was so hard that she was about to fall back, but something on her back prevented her from falling back. It was not a thing, it was a hand, a very big one at that. Her eyes snapped open, and when she looked before her, there was nothing. Not even a wall. Her eyes widened, and her hand lunged at her back where the hand was holding her. She could still feel that sensation on her back, but there was no one before her or even behind her. The corridor was empty. A zap of horror ran down her spine, and she instantly became pale. She bumped into someone, and that someone was holding her waist so that she wouldn't fall back. Before Lilith could grab her dress and run away from there, a voice startled her shitless. Snapping her head to the right, she saw her granny walking up to her. "I was Lou, what happened to you?" the old granny asked, her voice getting higher by the end of the sentence. Concern was plastered on her face as she stared at the pale face of Lilith. Did you see someone?" Lilith asked, almost breathless. Granny looked around with concern, but soon a frown covered her features. She looked back at Lilith while slowly shaking her head. "No. Did you?" the old granny asked, and Lilith shook her head while looking around. But someone was here. You bumped into someone, and his hand was on my back, but when I opened my eyes, he wasn't T3. Lilith stammered. Her horrified eyes stared at the path in horror. "Lilith, my child, please have your medicine," the old lady said, and Lilith snapped her eyes down at her. "Do you think I'm crazy?" "I'm not. I felt it, bumped in." Her panicked tone that was echoing in the silent corridor was interrupted by the old granny. Yes, I get it," she said and grabbed Lilith's arm, forcing her to walk. Lilith blinked to clear her blurry vision as she silently followed her granny. Another shiver ran down her spine when she felt a strong gaze on her. Looking around, she found no one. This wasn't the first time she felt like she was being watched. It has happened to her many times before, and each time it terrifies her. She could never get used to that sensation, never in a million years. What was that? Who was it? Could it be? She has been in this castle for 2 years, alone in her room or walking alone in the corridor. Nothing like this happened to her before here. Then why now? Wiping the sweat off of her forehead with a handkerchief, The granny pressed the cold metal tip of the spoon on Lilith's lips. It had that syrup that the physician gave her. Lilith looked up at the granny while sitting on the sofa. I think it's happening again. She stuttered, but the granny shook her head and made her drink the syrup. Once you become a king's wife, it won't occur, the granny said while putting away the syrup, hiding it somewhere the maids wouldn't find it. Is that another reason why you are so frantic for my marriage with Jasper? Lilith asked, her tone held disbelief. Yes, the granny said, and Lilith immediately shook her head, her eyes becoming watery. No one can stop him. He will get what he wants. Have you forgotten what he is like? She cried out. I don't want to face him again. Even his name brings nightmares for me. Do you think you are the only one desperate to get me away from him? She asked. Her tears were almost on the verge of streaming down. I can't even kill myself, in order to get away from him. Lilith sniffed and rubbed her eyes with the back of her hand. The old granny looked at her with empathy. She settled herself beside the young lady and patted her back. Jasper is not as weak as you think, the granny said softly and put her hair strand behind her ear. Lilith, God is not so cruel, my child. He only gives the pain one can handle. She continued. You are strong. Chapter 3. You are strong, the old granny declared while caressing Lilith's arm. Lilith took a deep breath and shook her head. When it comes to him, I'm not, she said, and turned back to look out of the window that was behind the sofa. She put her arm on the headrest of the sofa, and then her chin on her arm. He terrifies me, she whispered to herself. The old granny was unable to hear her words, but she heard the girl muttering to herself. Before she could ask what the young princess was saying, the doors of her room were knocked on twice before the doors were opened by the royal guards. The old granny immediately stood up from the sofa when the surroundings were invaded by the presence of the king. A tall man with black short hair that was a little ruffled stepped into the room. He was modeling in a long black coat with golden lining on the lapel, long black shoes, and inside he was wearing a black suit. Shoulders broad, long legs, a face that had a heroic handsomeness settled on its gentle features. He was Jasper, the king of the Logon kingdom and Lilith's soon-to-be husband. Your Highness. The old granny bowed at him and stepped aside. Lilith, who was busy looking out of the window, immediately stood up on her feet and looked at Jasper, rather surprised to find him here because he rarely comes around here. Your Highness, Lilith slightly nodded at him and he frowned, walking up to her. He abruptly grabbed her shoulders, almost making her flinch. You look sick, are you okay? He asked. Her eyes lashed towards the old granny before settling back on Jasper. I'm better than ever. I was thinking about the wedding, and that's why I couldn't sleep the whole night. And maybe that's why. She lied, and he smiled at her, cupping her cheeks. He squeezed them. Of course, why wouldn't you be happy? After all, you're marrying me, he said, and she passed him a tight-lipped smile. And I'm happy too, to have you as my wife and as the queen of this kingdom, he said. Lilith kept quiet and waited for him to say something further. She was never very talkative with him. She was once too talkative and nice with a certain someone, and now she was nothing but a trampled and pitiful princess. She thought Jasper would fix her, but he just couldn't. He moved back and turned towards the door. There is a guest I want you to meet, he said, and gestured to the guard standing near the door. After a few seconds someone stepped in, and both Granny and Lilith were left speechless. It was a woman. A beautiful blonde woman with big doe-like eyes walked in. She had big blue orbs, and freckles were resting on her nose and cheeks. She was extremely pale, and was tall and thin with perfect curves. Lilith was awestruck by her beauty, but at the same time, her insecurity doubled. She didn't stand against her beauty at all. No wonder why people thought of her as average. They must have seen beauty like these. Though Lilith never felt average or this insecure before, but ever since she became his fiancée, these things have started to claw her inside. This is Princess Sienna of the Castran Kingdom, younger sister of King Ragnar. He introduced her, and Lilith's eyes almost went wide. Castran Kingdom was one of the biggest kingdoms with one of the strongest lineages. He was marrying Lilith because she was beautiful and had a strong lineage. After Sienna's introduction, Lilith felt even more insecure. This woman was everything beyond what she was. And he came here all the way to introduce her to Lilith. He already fancies her. Lilith knew this day would come, but not this early. Sienna, as you know, this is Princess Lilith Draven, my bride, he said, and both the ladies nodded at each other elegantly with soft smiles adorning both of their faces. Lilith didn't let her expressions waver. I've heard a lot about you, Sienna said, stepping forward, and Lilith smiled, lowering her gaze to the floor before looking up at her again. I hope it's good, she said, and Sienna chuckled lowly. No, it's too good that it scares me, she said, and the room fell into silence. None of them got what she said. Jasper even had a frown on his face. Huh. Pardon my awful hearing, could you please repeat yourself? Lilith asked politely in an apologetic tone, and Sienna shook her head while smiling. Pardon me, I should have come clear, Sienna said, and all of them understood that she didn't want to repeat herself. Maybe she said it out as a farce, but no one got it. Lilith, Sienna wanted you to show her around, Jasper said, and Lilith raised her brows while nodding. Then shall we? Lilith asked Sienna, and the girl nodded rather excitedly. She looked childish and immature, but then again, she couldn't trust anyone. Both the girls, along with Jasper, walked out of the room. They went on another path, and Jasper took another path with his guards following him closely behind. So, Sienna, did you come alone? Lilith asked, both of them slowly walking down the stony lane. No, my big brother, King Ragnar, also came along with me, Sienna said, and Lilith passed her a little surprised look. Oh, I see, Lilith said, and showed her a little around. And we also have this huge library that I oft. Before Lilith could complete her sentence, an excited Sienna clung onto her out of nowhere. Library? I want to see the library, she said happily, and Lilith chuckled. I see, you like reading, Lilith said, and began to guide the girl to the library. She herself wasn't too familiar with the paths, since she rarely left her room, but she knew where the library was, since she often went there. She wasn't a reader, but since she had nothing to do, she read. What do you like to do? The girl asked, and Lilith's smile slowly vanished. I liked swords. Nothing much, Lilith said, and gestured to the guards to open the library doors. The guards bowed at her and obliged. Once the two royals stepped inside, the guards closed the door behind them. Sienna was awestruck. It's huge, just like mine. Can I look around? She asked, and Lilith immediately nodded at her. Please do as you please, Lilith said, and the girl hopped away. The castle was filled with guests. She thought she would find some people here, but the library was empty as always. Lilith watched the girl hop upstairs and lowered her gaze. She couldn't believe herself. She had become so negative. She thought bad about her. With a sigh, she walked further into the library and started to look around to find something interesting for herself. While she was looking around, she spotted a very interesting book. It had that maroon, velvety cover with golden lining on it. She wondered what it was about. She moved forward and stood on her toes in order to get the book, but she was unable to even touch it. She tried harder and stretched her arm further to the point where it started hurting. She gave up and was about to get down on her feet when all of a sudden a tall shadow came behind her out of nowhere, making her flinch badly. She felt someone behind her, too close to her. Her breath was stifled, and goosebumps started to rise on her skin. She saw his hand moving forward towards the book. The hand was big and long, actually too big even for a man. He was wearing a black glove that didn't cover all of his fingers. Lilith swallowed thickly and abruptly turned around to look at him, but what she felt next was a too familiar presence that terrified her to the core like a zap of current. She flinched and attached herself back to the bookshelf. He was tall, very tall, a lot taller than Jasper. She had to crane her neck to look up at him, and what she witnessed next almost made her legs go weak. Though there was no resemblance, yet there was so much resemblance. The man before her had long, shiny, dark silver hair and had dark gray eyes. The one she knew had black hair, but the aura was extremely familiar. His face was hidden by a black mask, only his eyes could be seen. He grabbed the book and brought it down, forwarding it towards her. She stared down at the book in horror. Her complexion went pale, as sweat started to coat her body. Was it really him? If it was him, he wouldn't show up in a disguise. His entrance would be rather bold. She was exaggerating every other thing. That man has left his imprint on her, and now she sees nothing but fear when even a little thing resembles him or makes her aware of his presence. Maybe she needs to go to the physician again. With her trembling hands, she grabbed the book, trying to stop her body from shaking, but it was useless. The man said nothing, so she hesitantly raised her head, and her heart almost lurked to her mouth when she found him peering down at her. When they made eye contact, his eyes, they were also familiar. Lilith was terrified. Before she could turn and run, Sienna's voice startled her. "Princess Lilith, I was looking for you," Sienna said while walking up to her with a book in her hand, but her pace slowed down once she saw the huge man standing in front of her. "Oh, brother?" Sienna stared at the man in front of her, calling him brother. Lilith's eyes slightly widened when she realized who this man was and why he was covering his face. He was King Ragnar, the king in disguise. He didn't show his face to others. Only his people and family knew what he looked like. People had their own theories about him. Some said he was too handsome, that's why he hid his face. Some said it could be a disgusting scar that he was hiding. And some said that he was not that handsome, and only his hidden appearance was extraordinary. He doesn't seem to care about these things at all. Lilith relaxed a little, but she was tense as ever. Sienna smiled and walked up to them. She wrapped her arm around her brother's arm and looked at Lilith while smiling. "Oh my, did my brother scare you?" she asked, her smile dropping instantly after seeing Lilith. The girl was a wreck this morning. This many jump scares never came to her before. Lilith passed a glance at her brother, and he was still staring at her, so she immediately dropped her gaze back to Sienna while shaking her head, a fake smile plastered on her face. "Oh, that's a relief. People usually get scared due to his huge appearance," Sienna said. "Anyways, brother, this is Princess Lilith Draven, the bride. And Princess Lilith, this is my brother King Ragnar." Sienna introduced them to each other. Both of them passed each other a slight nod. She should be saying something. A whole damn king was standing in front of her, but words wouldn't leave her mouth. She was just uncomfortable. She wanted to leave immediately. The monster she knew was known by no one, and this was King Ragnar, one of the greatest kings in his lineage. Kings of all kings. She really needed to say something here, but instead of that, she excused herself and trekked away. Embarrassing herself. Entering her room, the first thing she did was drink a lot of water. This happened 3 times today. She flinched so much as well. And someone stood before her who resembled him. Him. Her terror. Her destroyer. The wedding must happen. "I will come for you, my butterfly." His words rang in her mind with the exact tone he spoke with. No, the wedding must take place a week before, she thought while pacing around the room. When his fear fell upon her, the wedding she thought couldn't save her was suddenly her only desperate option. There was nothing else to save herself from him. To be exact, not even this wedding.
Want to win a free bundle of 3 amazing audiobooks? Comment Dark Fantasy below for a chance to win. No limit on entries. Comment as many times as you like. I will select 5 random comments. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for new books every weekend.
Chapter 4. What? In 2 days? Jasper asked, who was sitting on his master chair busy with some paperwork, was left stunned for a second by Lilith's words. She rarely comes around here and rarely demands for anything. But now, when she came to him and demanded for the wedding to happen earlier than before, he didn't know what to do. Leaning back against the master chair, he took a deep breath. "Yeah, I know the reason for that," he asked, looking at her. His eyes moved down to her body and paused on her chest that was abnormally moving up and down, indicating that she was running not long ago. He looked back up at her. "Ah, you see, I'm afraid something might happen before that. It could delay the wedding. I'm just not having a good feeling about that," she said while fidgeting with her fingers. Her eyes moved up to his face, and there were lots of questions hidden in his expressions. Before he could ask something, she immediately continued. "I don't want any wedding present. I just want the wedding to happen in 2 days," she said, and he lowered his gaze as if thinking hard. She thought he wouldn't agree, but when he nodded his head, she felt a great sense of relief washing over her. "Though I didn't quite get your reason, but I will fulfill this demand of yours," he said, and a wide smile kissed her features, making his eyes go double in size. She was smiling, and it was a happy smile and a genuine smile. Something he never witnessed in these whole 2 years. All of a sudden, he stood up and slowly walked up to her. Her smile dropped with each step he took closer to her. He paused in front of her, and she just silently stared at him until he put his fingers under her chin, raising her face. "Is there something wrong?" she asked nervously, and he smiled at her. "Nothing. I like the way you smile," he said, and her pupils slightly dilated. "I like the way you cry, so beautiful." His words rang in her head, and something known as fear clutched her heart in its vicious grip until Jasper brought her back to the present by kissing her lips. Her eyes widened when she felt his lips on hers. She stilled for a second and didn't know what to do or how to react. This was the first time they kissed. As a princess, she was always taught not to get intimate with a man before marriage. Not to fall in love with anyone unless he was a royal. However, the things she learned were of no use, and the man kissing her wasn't her first kiss either. She was torn off from all of these the day the beast decided to show itself 2 years back. The way he held her and did things to her all to his likings, she realized that all of those teachings were of no use against a man's desire. He was a beast. She still remembers how he held her and viciously kissed her. The feeling of helplessness, fear, and terror were marked over her 6 senses forever. She put her hands on Jasper's chest and shut her eyes when he licked her lips, asking for entrance. When she didn't open her lips, he harshly bit on her lower lip, making her hiss as she abruptly stepped back from him while covering her mouth with the back of her hand. "Oh, pardon me," he said, looking a bit surprised as he wasn't expecting this reaction from her. It's fine," she said, lowering her hand, and he noticed the little bruise on her lower lip caused by him. "I will take my leave now," she said, turned around and immediately left. As soon as she left, his expression turned bitter. "How boring," he said with an eye roll. If it wasn't for the great wealth of the fallen kingdom she inherited, he wouldn't even look at her. At night, with a mirror in her hand, Lilith stared at the mark on her lower lip. It made her remember the time he kissed her, left her lips bruised and swollen. For some reason, every other thing these days makes her remember him, and makes her feel that fear all over again. Maybe she needed to continue on her medicine. Keeping the mirror on the dressing table, she closed the window and the door, locking them before walking up to the bed. She doesn't lock her door usually, but when his memories claws her senses, she locks herself away. Once she settled on the bed, she took her medicine. Though, this medicine doesn't help her with her nightmares, but it maybe helps her to stop hallucinating. But was she really hallucinating? Because of him, she's fighting here, pondering if she's mentally ill or not. Lying on the bed and covering herself with a duvet, she closed her eyes and blocked her mind from thinking. Hoping not to get any nightmares, just like every other night, she drifted off to sleep. The room was warm when she drifted off to sleep, but in the middle of the night, when the castle was indulged in darkness and the paths were vacant, the rooms were locked and the warmth was there, but something was peculiar with her surroundings. She felt extremely cold. Her lips shivered as she curled her body in a ball and covered herself properly with the duvet. Her eyes were closed and she was half asleep. She didn't bother getting up, because she remembered very well that she locked everything. She tried to doze off until she felt a zap of current ran down her spine like a lightning, making her eyes snap open as those hazel orbs stared up in horror. Her orbs dilated, and hazel looked like an outline. It was all due to sheer fear that engulfed her whole upon witnessing the man on top of her. His face, she couldn't see it, but his huge body on top of her, she could see it. Her orbs throbbed in terror when she noticed those big pale hands holding her waist down. She couldn't see his face, but she could see his huge body hovering over her, feel his extreme aura, and feel his touch. She realized that she wasn't in a ball. She was lying straight with no duvet covering her. His one hand was holding her waist, while his other hand had her wrists easily locked above her head. Her orbs continued to throb in terror as tears began to roll down her temple. It was him. Her terror. Her nightmare. She couldn't move. She tried to, but she couldn't. It was obviously just one of the worst nightmares. Fortunately, she couldn't see his face, otherwise she would have died from a heart attack. She never saw his face in her dreams. It was just those evil eyes and words of his that haunted her. This one felt too realistic to be a nightmare, but it was one. She knew no medicine could cure her. His fear was permanently imprinted on all of her 6 senses. He had corrupted her whole. It was as if she was hypnotized. His hand that was on her waist slowly started to travel up. A soundless gasp escaped her lips when that big huge hand of his cupped her right bosom twice before moving up. She wanted to scream for help, but words were sealed in her mouth. She could only hear her muffled cries. She flinched badly, and her heart lurked up to her mouth when she heard his all-too-familiar voice. It was deep and held excitement in the tone, a menacingly calm excitement. "He kissed you?" he asked, his cold thumb caressing her lightly bruised lower lip. She felt like her heart would come out of her mouth any time soon. He knew it. He knows everything. There was no way she could hide from him. "You dare let him touch you? Have you already forgotten who your master is?" he asked, his thumb pad roughly caressing her lower lip, bruising her already bruised lip even more. "What did I tell you last time?" he asked. She wanted to close her eyes shut, but she couldn't even do that. Tears were continuously rolling down her temple, even when all he did was talk. What did he tell her last time? "I will destroy the one you seek for, in order to get away from me." She put Jasper and his kingdom on stake, just to get away from this monster when she knew very well that there was no way out. "How disobedient you are," he said. She jolted when she felt his hand in her hair. He was caressing her silky hair strands ever so slowly. "But don't worry, even my most ruthless demon can't afford to harm you. My butterfly is so fragile, I'm afraid I'll break it." Her eyes widened when she heard him whispering all of this right next to her ear. She could even feel his hot breath hitting her ear. It was just too realistic to be a dream. Her heart was wildly slamming against her ribcage, and her body was trembling like a leaf. He was a sharp, vicious knife dipped in honey for her. "Remember one thing. Even if you get married as early as possible, nothing can really take you away from me. Not even you, and not even your God. Because I am your master." Lilith's breath was knocked out of her system when she felt something cold on her lips. And just like that, everything went blurry, and her eyes snapped open. Drenched in sweat, gasping for air, duvet, bedsheet, and the robe she was wearing were all in disheveled condition. Her wide eyes stared up at the fancy stone-carved ceiling as her chest heaved up and down aggressively. She was stiff like a board, and her whole body was aching painfully. A light was peeking through the slick of the curtain, indicating that it was morning already. Though she was sleeping all this time, but it felt like she didn't sleep a blink. It was another nightmare. Worse than ever. She slowly sat up straight, and frowned soon after when she realized that her face was wet. Even the pillow was drenched because of her tears. She raised her hand and wiped the tears away. She could still feel his touch, his breath, and the fear for him. While she was wiping her tears, She noticed something on her wrist, and it was as if the world stilled around her. Her horrified gaze was fixated on her bruised wrist. The heartbeat that calmed down eventually fastened again in fear. She looked at her other wrist, and it was also bruised. His hold wasn't tight, but it left such bruises. No, why does she have them? Wasn't she having a nightmare? Her lower lip also felt weird. Slowly getting off the bed, she stood up on her shaky legs and walked up to the dressing table, almost losing her balance on the way. With her trembling hands, she grabbed the mirror and focused it on her lips. And the next moment, the mirror fell down from her hand and on the cold floor, shattering into tiny pieces. Lilith stumbled back and fell on the floor, harshly landing on her butt as a sob raked through her body. Her lips were swollen, and the bruise on her lower lip was even worse. It was as if he was here to remove Jasper's touch from her. But why? How? She locked everything. How did he get in? Or perhaps he was already hiding in here, but his huge presence couldn't be hidden anywhere here. Everything that happened was real. He was here. He was watching her. He was also planning something. He could clearly stop the wedding before it's happening, but he was waiting for something. What? Could it be that he was here to destroy Jasper's kingdom? She had so many things on her mind. Tears wouldn't stop rolling down her eyes. She stood up on her trembling legs but fell down again, so she took the support of the bed and stood up while crying. She checked the door and it was still locked, but the window that she clearly remembers locking was unlocked, and there was nothing beneath there to land on, just a rugged ground that was so far, a normal person wouldn't survive if he jumped out of here. How did he manage to get in? Was he already inside, watching her all the time? A shudder ran down her spine, and she covered her mouth to stop the loud sobs that were escaping her lips. She couldn't digest the fact that he was actually here. He was here to get her. He was here to destroy humanity once again. He was here to cage her forever. What could she even do to escape him? His intentions felt like he was here to destroy Jasper's kingdom, so even if she doesn't marry Jasper, that monster would destroy it. She rubbed a hand down her face. There was no way she could escape that monster. But where was he at the moment? Chapter 5. What suddenly got into you? You asked for the marriage to happen earlier than before, and you look like you've been sick for years when tomorrow is your wedding. The old granny started to rant once she stepped inside the room. Lilith, who was sitting on the couch, nicely dressed like always by the maids, had a dull look on her face. The makeup couldn't hide the dull and void look in her eyes. The helplessness and fear she felt was beyond her control. She hated him. She always would. Gosh, look at you, the old granny said in a stressful tone, and settled down beside Lilith on the sofa. Lilith, who had her hands on the sofa on either side of her thighs with her head hanging low, took a deep heavy breath before raising her head and turned to look at the old granny right in the eyes. The old lady stared at her face, stunned. Her lips were bruised and swollen. Before she could ask something, Lilith raised both of her bruised wrists in front of her. Her eyes widened even more as she grabbed both of Lilith's wrists and stared at them in shock. He did it. Alara. He's here, Granny B, but he's wall waiting to destroy. Lilith stuttered and pulled both of her wrists out of her hold. She stood up on her weak legs and began to pace around the room. She told the old lady everything that happened, except the part where he harassed her. The old granny was left speechless. Fear could be seen on her face as well. She couldn't even deny it anymore, because the marks on Lilith's body screamed his presence around. What should I do? Lilith asked. Should I let Jasper know? Just as this question left Lilith's lips, the granny abruptly stood up while shaking her head. Have you lost your mind? He will not marry you, and what if he throws us and our people out? What would you do? The granny asked, and Lilith took a deep breath. We will go back to our land, Lilith said, and the old lady slowly shook her head. Our land has been taken over by those blood-sucking monsters, the old lady said, and Lilith felt a hard and painful thud on her chest. Does Jasper know that? Nobody knows the real cause of our kingdom's fall. Shouldn't we let others know? Shouldn't we let Jasper know so they can be cautious? Lilith asked desperately, and the old granny shook her head with a stern look on her face. If they come to know, they will kick us out or even worse, execute us. Can't you be a little selfish for your people? The granny asked, and Lilith frowned. If that monster attacks this kingdom, our people will die too. Lilith said, before adding, "What's gotten into you?" she asked, not liking the behavior of her old granny. Jasper won't let that happen, the old granny said. My father wasn't weak either, Lilith retorted. I never said that, the granny let out. They destroyed us for something bad your father did to them that we don't know. Why would he do the same with Jasper? You're thinking too much, the old lady said. That monster was lying. My father never wronged someone, Lilith said, and turned her back towards the old lady. I don't know why he's behind Jasper's kingdom. Maybe he's not behind his kingdom. This time he's behind me, and he is onto something in order to get me, Lilith said, slowly relaxing herself after having a little heated conversation with the old granny. Whatever it is, you're getting married to Jasper tomorrow. It's too late to back off now. Draven Kingdom might have fallen, but it still upholds its great respect, the old granny said. Her tone was soft but stern at the same time. Just as she said this, she left the room, leaving an even more perplexed Lilith behind. Not being able to breathe, Lilith left the room and trekked towards the garden of the castle for some fresh air. She had so much on her mind, so she decided to filter it out for a while to relax, otherwise she'd turn into a dead body in no time. She sat down on the soft grass and took a deep breath. Upon inhaling the fresh scent of flowers, her tensed shoulders instantly relaxed. She stared up at the sky. Since she wasn't thinking about the present and the future, her mind took her to the past, and she remembered how happy and fortunate she was. In those memories, she had a family, she had her people. They all had a glorious kingdom. They had their culture which they used to follow with no hindrance or nothing holding them back. But now nothing was left. Sometimes she blames herself for that. A soft giggle of a woman coming from nearby brought her back to the present. Her ears perked up, and her eyes began to search for the source of that laughter until she heard it again. Her head snapped to the left, and what she saw next had her pupils slightly dilating. Jasper and Sienna were standing on the top terrace of the castle. They looked so busy talking and laughing that they weren't even aware of their surroundings. Look at them. They look like they are getting married tomorrow, instead of the real couple. She knew Jasper didn't love her, but she also didn't expect him to flip this early. He knew she'd never demand anything from him. He knew what kind of a woman she was, and that's why he chose her. Marry her. Make her the queen. And then keep her aside, forever. Well, this was much better than being in the arms of a monster. She found something really weird about this situation. Lilith knew Jasper, but why was Sienna talking to him like that? No princess talks to a king like that, who's about to get married tomorrow. Same goes for him, but Lilith knew he didn't love her. But then also, Sienna knows nothing. While she was pondering on this, she felt an intense gaze on her. Her shoulders instantly tensed and her eyes slightly widened. It was the same feeling as before, the feeling of being watched. She looked around but found no one, just guards walking here and there. This area of the castle was the most peaceful one in these wedding days. Her breath quickened as she looked back at the castle. Those two were busy with their conversation. Just as she was about to get up, her eyes went slightly down towards the right, and it was as if the world stilled around her. King Ragnar, standing near the window of his guest room, was staring right at her. His eyes, she could feel them on her. Why was he staring at her? Why did his gaze bring a familiar yet terrifying sensation to her? His gaze made her go still for a good while. She would have thought of him as a ghost if she wasn't aware of his true identity. Goosebumps started to rise on her skin. She couldn't look away. She was terrified. Her thoughts that she was blocking came flooding in with more assumptions. First thing first, she needed to stay away from him. None of them moved. Her heartbeat was a mess. The more she sat there staring at him, the more terrified she felt. With much difficulty, she lashed her gaze away from him, grabbed her dress, stood up on her trembling legs, and started to walk away from him. She could still feel his gaze on her back. Why would a king stare at her like that? Both of these siblings were radiating a weird energy, and Lilith knew she needed to stay away from them. Watching her back like a hawk, Ragnar stayed rooted to his spot, his gaze eyeing her solely. His room was indulged in darkness, and the morning light that was coming through the window was blocked by his huge figure. His one hand was on the wall, and the other one behind his back. He poked his cheek from inside with his tongue, as he watched her completely disappear from his sight. "I see, you have begun denying me. Seems like I gotta move even faster." Last night memories flashed in his mind, and an evil smirk soon appeared on his face with two dimples that added fuel to that devilish smirk. "My little Lilith," he whispered under his breath, and closed his eyes upon remembering her beneath him last night. "I can't wait to put my claim on you forever." Chapter 6. The wedding day was knocking on the door in no time. The kingdom was bustling with happiness. Every other person was out on the streets, most of them were dressed nicely, and a few were dressed normally like any other day. People were gossiping and dancing in groups on every other street, enjoying themselves to the fullest. While the atmosphere in the castle was no different. A low violin was playing in the hall of the castle. Every other guest was nicely dressed in royalty. Maids and servants were walking around with trays in their hands that held juice and wine glasses. Everyone was busy, gossiping until the groom arrived. Lilith took a deep, heavy breath. A deep crease of frown was settled on her forehead. She wasn't feeling good or happy at all. Instead, she felt like crying. She was dearly missing her family and was on the verge of tears. Once she was married to Jasper, she was bound to him for life. Only if things went the right way. She prayed to God to give her patience to deal with Jasper if he treats her like she doesn't exist. Lilith was dressed in a white floral wedding dress. It was perfectly kissing her upper body, while it had a large floral from down. She had a white thin veil covering her face. Her hair was nicely slicked back in a puffy bun, and a little makeup was applied on her face that gave her even more of a softer look. While she was sitting on the couch of her room, busy biting her nails while feeling extremely sad and nervous, the door of her room opened and the old granny walked in. The old granny was also dressed nicely in a baby pink color dress. She paused, stared at Lilith for a good while before settling down beside her on the couch. "What's with that face?" the old granny asked, and Lilith huffed a sigh, looking away. "Isn't it obvious?" Lilith asked ever so slowly. "You're sad." The old granny let out and heaved a sigh. "I know, you don't have any feelings for Jasper, but we're doing this for your own good," the old granny said, and Lilith scoffed. "You and I are both delusional. If I marry and that monster still comes at us, things will get even worse because of this marriage, and I think he's exactly waiting for that before showing up," Lilith said, and the granny shook her head while clicking her tongue. "Let's forget about him. Everyone is waiting for you. Let's go," the granny said, cutting the topic and immediately getting up. She helped Lilith up and helped her walk out of the room while grabbing her floral from behind. Before they stepped out of the room, "Remember not to give them any excuse to talk to you," Granny said, indirectly telling Lilith to smile and act happy even though she wasn't feeling like it. Lilith stepped out of the room, and she was handed a bouquet of white roses. Upon reaching the entrance gates of the hall, the granny let go of her dress, fixed the floral of the dress, and stepped back. Lilith took a deep breath, getting herself ready when she heard the guard yelling in the hall that Princess Lilith was about to enter. With that, the huge gates of the hall were opened and she began to walk on the red carpet that was leading to the aisle. The guests started to clap ever so slowly and elegantly. Every pair of eyes were fixed on her. A soft smile was kissing her features. She slowly raised her eyes and looked at Jasper, who was standing on the aisle with a faint smile on his face. He looked handsome as always, but her eyes were searching for someone else as they roamed around the hall. She saw Sienna, but his extraordinary presence was nowhere. Where was King Ragnar? Once she reached near Jasper, he forwarded his hand towards her and she took it. He smiled at her, and she passed him a smile as well. The ceremony began, and they took their vows. Lilith tried her best not to be hesitant, because the decision was made and there was no going back. "You may kiss the bride," the priest said, and Jasper stepped forward. Lilith swallowed thickly, praying inside that he doesn't kiss her on the lips. He raised her veil, smiled at her, and leaned in. Just as she feared, he kissed her right on her lips. It was a deep peck. Everyone started to clap once the priest officially announced them as husband and wife, the king and queen of the Logon kingdom. Everyone was happy except the bride herself, but she continued to smile the brightest because that's what she gotta do from now onwards. The celebration began, and the guests started to greet them one by one, wishing the new couple a happy and blessed life. Sienna also walked up to them with a huge yet elegant smile on her face. She happily congratulated them, and Lilith noticed how the light in Jasper's eyes changed. Sure, she was not dumb. She could see the change in his gaze. "Already?" was the thing that crossed her mind. "Where's our main guest, King Ragnar?" Jasper asked, and Lilith's ears immediately perked up. Sienna looked back at the guest and turned back to face the couple. "He must be here somewhere. He'll surely come and congratulate you both," Sienna said, and Jasper nodded. "He came to our wedding. It's a huge blessing in itself," Jasper said, and Lilith almost raised a brow. So this man knew he was not the only blessing. Lilith roamed her eyes around and still found him nowhere. He was a huge man who could be spotted from afar. She didn't understand why she was looking for him, and didn't feel quite right about it because deep down, she knew exactly why she was looking for him, and the thought alone scared her. And the feeling of being watched was continuously haunting her. She couldn't see him, so she gave herself an excuse that she was the bride, and everyone would obviously look at her. She lowered her gaze, shook his thoughts away, and continued to meet the guest, completely unaware that the devil was actually watching her like a hawk. Dare he pull his eyes away from her, even for a second? Chapter 7. His gaze was dead set on her. He was sitting on a chair in the corner of the hall, with a half-filled wine glass in his hand. It was a perfect spot to have a clear view of her. Nothing mattered to him, other than the woman standing there in white. Being patient wasn't his thing. He so wanted to burn this castle down, and drag her down this aisle with him. What would she do? What could she even do? What could anyone else do? Nothing. But this wasn't the right moment for all of that. For a sweeter fruit, one should be patient. He really had made that poor little thing go insane, but he was a lot more selfish than this. He knew what he was very well, and he held no guilt either, nor was he planning to change. He was a monster, and he gladly accepted it. Others' fear and terror brought him extreme ecstasy. For him, nothing really mattered other than his empire and his little wounded butterfly. Oh, how unfortunate she was. Her kindness rattled her down, and brought him to his knees for her. Oh, how badly he wanted to kiss her, see her helpless struggle and cry when nothing could get her away from him. All she could do was cry beautifully for him. She was someone that made him feel things after so long. He would only let her go when the day he didn't feel any of those feelings for her again. He wondered if that day would even arrive, because he was madly obsessed with that woman. It all started when he was bored, and his uncle gave him something to entertain and feast on. What was it like when a bored yet malicious soul finds something new to feed on? Catastrophic. A powerful one could have the vision of conquering something. It could either be a kingdom to rule on, a thing to add to their possessions, or a person to prey on. A single blow against them either had them rattling down on the floor, or prowling for their enemies with intensity and madness that was never seen in them before. Was it the pride that was hurt? Or just revenge? Nonetheless, once the enemies are under the claws, life becomes pretty boring and one becomes aimless. A beast dying to hunt comes across a wounded butterfly. One blow from him and it'd be nothing. Yet it fluttered away with those broken wings and was so hard to hold on to. A new adventure for him. An escape attempt from her. Raking a hand through his long dark silver hair, he gazed at her with his orbs that resembled the moon, yet they weren't gentle or generous enough to shine upon you. Eyes of a predator gazing at its prey, prey of someone as disastrous as him. He kept swirling the wine glass in his hand. His eyes moved with her every action of greeting. That gentle smile that kissed her features. The soft, silky, and white fabric that kissed her dainty figure. Her eyes shined due to happiness, but were unable to hide that fear that resides in them at the same time. She was also unable to hide the love and respect that she had for that man beside her. The one she was standing so close to. The one who now owned her. But she was his from the moment he set his eyes on her. No matter if she was in a wedding dress, no matter if she was happy with the one beside her. Because only he could hold on to her. Break her or fix her. All onto his mercy. Keeping the glass on the table beside him, he stood up straight to his mighty height and began to walk towards the so-called new couple. Every head turned in his direction as he made his way towards them. People on their own getting out of his way, and he didn't even have to turn his steps to pass by someone. Men stared at him enviously, and women on the other hand were drooling over him, dreaming to sleep with him once when they were clearly royal females. Yes, his power was something he was completely aware of. His eyes zeroed on the hand on Lilith's waist, and his jaw twitched, gaze hardening. Patience, patience, he whispered to himself. Lilith smiled at the guest as they walked away after congratulating the couple. She turned to meet the guest who just came before them, but as soon as her eyes met his, she paused. Everything instantly stilled around her. Her heartbeat quickened. Upon seeing her reaction, his heart jolted up in sheer excitement as he peered down at her with a hooded gaze. He reminded her of her terror, though she wasn't quite sure if it was him. He knew everything all too well. "Oh, King Ragnar." Jasper let go of her waist and stepped forward. "Congratulations to you both." Lilith's heart almost lurched to her mouth upon hearing his voice. It was a deep voice, it had smoothness in it. He said each word slowly. "Just like him." Lilith stared at him. Though she tried her best to act normal, like she was being with everyone else, but she just couldn't hide the fear that radiated in her eyes. That aura, that voice, almost everything about this man reminded her of that monster. He shook hands with Jasper and turned towards Lilith. Before her eyes could meet his again, she lowered her gaze and soon found his large hand in front of her gaze. With breath stuck midway in throat, she hesitantly raised her hand and put it on his palm, feeling the roughness of his glove and coldness of his fingertips both at the same time. She swallowed thickly when he slowly bent down and raised her hand up to almost its full arm length even when he was bending down. He was also as huge as that monster. Every eye in the hall was watching them, completely stunned by how huge he looked next to the bride. Of course, he was a king from one of the biggest lineages. Having this kind of physique was considered nothing to him. Lilith swallowed thickly when he pecked the back of her hand with his clothed lips. Male guests would usually just nod at her. It was not considered a really good thing to kiss the bride's hand on her wedding day, which was considered normal on other days, but people tried to avoid doing it on the wedding day because the groom wouldn't like it. The people who did it for fun in some weddings were playfully shushed away by the groom, but Jasper stood still on his spot, completely unbothered by it, but the guests noticed every other little detail as they began to whisper things to each other. But the problem was this man before her. He didn't hesitate to kiss her hand. He didn't look like he would play around either. He looked serious, even though only his eyes could be seen. Her eyes slowly widened when she felt his thumb deliberately caressing her soft skin before he let go of her hand. He nodded once again at Jasper before walking away. Just as he turned around, all the whispers instantly died. Lilith silently watched his back, but her mind and heart was in chaos. This man, she needed to avoid him no matter what. At night time, when a few guests have already left for their lands, some were resting in their rooms, and some were just roaming around in the cold night, enjoying themselves to the fullest, considering it their last night here. Siana appeared at the young couple sitting on the fresh grass of the garden, in the cold night. She drew the curtain back and turned to look at Ragnar. Ragnar was standing in the middle of the room, dressed in his black signature suit with a black heavy cloak over that suit of his. His dark gray and long hair was resting on his shoulders. 2 swords were attached on either side of his sturdy waist, resting in their scabbards. He was wearing long black leather boots that ended just below his knee. He looked everything but real, with that majestic look of his. Currently, the guest room he was standing in was indulged in darkness, with only one dim lamp in the corner enlightening the room slightly. His back was facing Siana, while he was facing 4 men standing before him. They were also wearing cloaks with half of their faces covered like Ragnar. "My king, we should depart," one of the men said, and Ragnar's gaze hardened. "Yes, I need to teach that witch a little lesson," Ragnar declared, and turned towards Siana as he began to walk towards the window. Siana immediately turned towards the window, drew the curtains away, and opened the window before quickly stepping back. Ragnar paused beside her while staring straight ahead. "You know what to do," he said. "Yes, master. I will not let you down," she said and bowed at him. Without sparing her a single glance, Ragnar jumped out of the window followed by other 4 men. Siana moved forward and looked outside. They were nowhere in sight. She looked back at the couple, a smirk kissing her face as she peered at them while licking her lips. "Thanks for the food." Chapter 8. Sitting on the bed, still dressed in the wedding gown, Lilith was waiting for Jasper. He would have been here with her, but since a few guests were to leave early, he went off to greet them away. He asked her if she wanted to come along, but she refused. She was too tired to roam around the castle in this dress. With a deep sigh, she looked around her new room. It was one of the biggest rooms in the castle, which now belonged to her and Jasper, the newly wedded couple. The room was surrounded by candles that were enlightening the room, giving it a decorative look. A pleasant scent was coming out of those candles, making her a little sleepy. The room had almost 5 windows with huge curtains drawn over them. She yawned and leaned back against the headboard of the bed. She decided to rest her eyes for a while, but as soon as she closed her eyes, a sound of knock had her jolted up. She looked towards the door, wondering who it was, but when she heard the sound of knocking again, her pupils dilated in shock. It wasn't the door. It was the window. Lilith's eyes widened. Her pupils ran over every single window, and the noise was coming from the one right in front of her. A shudder ran down her spine when she realized that there was no floor to stand on behind that window. Knock, knock. A whimper died down on her lips. She immediately scooted back, pressing her body to the headboard as much as she could. The loud noise of the wind had her heart rattling, followed by knocking. Knock, knock. Lilith shrieked and jumped off the bed, almost tripping and falling down face first because of that huge dress of hers. She grabbed her gown in a fist and dashed towards the door. She abruptly opened the door with force, and as soon as she stepped out, she halted on her steps. The pathway looked even more dreadful. There was not a single soul around the area, and the dimly lit lamps were of barely any use. She took a deep breath and stepped back into the room, closing the door. She slowly turned around and looked all over the room before slowly ambling up to the bed. The knocking has died down. The wind has calmed down as well. She slowly sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the window through her lashes. When no sound of knocking came for a while, she stood up and slowly walked up to that window. With a deep breath, she raised her sweaty hands and abruptly drew the curtains away from the window. Her heartbeat instantly started to calm down when she found no one standing there. She decided to open the window and look around, but little did she know that was a very wrong move from her side. As soon as she opened the window, a harsh gust of wind slapped her hull, making her stumble back. All the candles were blown out, and the room instantly fell into darkness. The only source of light was the dim moonlight that was coming through the open window, along with the chilly wind. All the other windows were slightly rattling. Lilith covered her eyes with her arm and turned around with a hiss when some dirt got into her eyes. The wind definitely calmed down. It was as if it was waiting for her to open the window, and that knocking was definitely not because of the window. There was someone knocking the window. All of these abnormal pheromones only screamed one thing, and it terrified her. Before she could turn around to close the window, it felt like the window suddenly got blocked by something. She slowly lowered her arm, and her eyes widened when she saw a huge shadow cascading on the wall because of the moonlight. Her wide eyes stared at the shadow. It was not her shadow. It was the shadow of the one standing behind her. She could feel its presence right behind her. Her pupils started to throb in horror. She parted her trembling lips with much difficulty, wanting to scream, but before the call for help could even form on her tongue, the man behind her clamped his huge hand on her mouth, almost covering all of her face as he pulled her back against his sturdy body. A cry left her lips that got muffled. Lilith went numb in terror. His hand was as cold as ice. Tears started to form in her eyes. It was him. This wasn't a nightmare. She wasn't in a daze. It was really him this time. Tears blurred her sight, she couldn't breathe. Her nose and mouth were both blocked by his huge hand. Her chest started to heave up and down. She was trembling like a leaf. She flinched when she felt his other hand on her stomach, as he pulled her body even more into his. A loud muffled cry left her lips when she felt his cold breath right next to her ear. Warm tears trickled down her eyes and caressed his cold hand. It was him. She just couldn't digest the fact that it was really him this time. She didn't even know how many times he showed up before, but right now this one was the most realistic one. All of her senses were on high alert. She even dreaded raising her hands and holding onto his hand in order to pull his hand away from her mouth. She knew he wouldn't let go unless he wanted to. A muffled sob raked her body, but before another one could rattle her again, she froze upon hearing him. Shish. She stilled. Her chest continued to heave up and down, and little whimpers remained inside her as she stood still on her spot. Good girl. Her eyes widened when she heard him whisper those words ever so slowly and sensually in her ear. His voice was a deep timbre of the darkest sea. Lilith jolted. Tears began to trickle down her eyes like rainfall when she felt his cold lips on the shell of her ear. He pecked her ear before moving down to her neck. Her eyes widened, and her hands on their own moved up and gripped his hand. She began to struggle in his hold, but it was of no use. It just made it worse for her, because she held zero strength against this monster. A new type of terror engulfed her. Her tearful eyes unconsciously closed in fear when she felt his long and cold tongue licking the warm skin of her neck in an upward motion to her jaw. Pecking her jaw, she felt him moving away. Her eyes snapped open when she felt his hand that was on her stomach move upwards to her hair, and the next moment, with a click sound, her hair rolled down, curtaining her shoulder. He wrapped his hand around her veil and tugged at it, yanking it off her head. He let go of her mouth, making her gasp out loudly as she tried to pull away from him, but he yanked her back. His cold lips lingered over the shell of his ear. She was trembling like a leaf while trying to breathe properly. She knew even if he let her go, she wouldn't be able to run away because her legs were on the brink of giving up. She was petrified out of her wits. The goosebumps of fear on her skin were as evident as ever. His hot breath was a constant knock of terror in her head. Her heart was pounding with such force she was certain at any second it would burst out of her chest. She flinched when he grabbed a fistful of her hair and tugged it up on her scalp, baring her nape. She almost shrank into herself when he gave an open-mouthed kiss on her nape. A jolt of shiver ran down her spine when she felt his wet tongue on her skin. She closed her eyes as a shuddering whimper left her lips. Lilith couldn't handle it anymore. She couldn't even get herself to snuck a side glance at him. He let go of her hair, making them fall on her shoulder as she felt him retreating. This time, he was taking her veil with him. Without a single noise, the surroundings fell into eerie silence, and she couldn't feel his cold presence behind her. She slowly raised her gaze and stared at the wall, which now had no shadow cast on it other than hers. He came, touched her to his liking, and left. She turned around and quickly closed the window without even looking outside. Once she locked the window, she began to walk backward and settled down on the edge of the bed. Tears wouldn't stop pouring out of her eyes. Her body wouldn't stop trembling. She never thought she'd fear someone this much to even forget who she really was.
Want to win a free bundle of 3 amazing audiobooks? Comment Dark Fantasy below for a chance to win. No limit on entries. Comment as many times as you like. I will select 5 random comments. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for new books every weekend.
Chapter 9. While she was sitting on the edge of the bed, trying to calm herself, she heard footsteps coming from the corridor outside. She abruptly stood up, wiped her tears, and sat down on the bed. Though it clearly seemed like she went through something. Her eyes were red, the veil was gone, and hair was in a little disheveled condition. She took a deep breath in order to calm her abnormal breathing, trying her best to act normal, like nothing happened, because she knew Jasper would never understand or believe her even if she told him the truth. He would think just like everyone else. Granny has strictly told her not to disclose this matter to Jasper, no matter what. Probably because she thought he would start thinking of her as crazy, and might regret making her his queen. Though she wasn't wrong. Lilith would have retaliated, but she didn't because she knew Jasper would never understand her, and would most probably act as the old granny predicted. To her, they didn't really have a husband and wife kind of bond, and she knew that somewhere he feels the same. But maybe if they try, things could change. Love could happen after marriage as well. The door of their room opened as Jasper walked inside. He glanced at her before turning around and locking the door. Lilith tensed upon hearing the sound of the door locking. In order to get away from that monster, she got married, totally forgetting that now she was bonded in an intimate relationship as well. He sat down in front of her with a low huff. "Pardon me. I would have come earlier if it wasn't for King Ragnar to leave earlier," Jasper stated while looking at her. Lilith slightly frowned upon hearing his words. "He left?" she asked, and he nodded. "Something urgent came, he had to leave," he said, and moved forward. "Ah, then what about Sienna?" Lilith asked, trying to keep up the conversation, but she knew she couldn't run away from the deed. She just needs a little time to prepare herself mentally for this. That monster clouded her thoughts so much that she didn't even ponder over what her marriage life would be like. She thought of marriage as an escape from him. "She is here. She will leave in a day or 2. Jasper replied, and Lilith lowered her gaze. If she came with her brother, she should have left with her brother. Why bother staying in this boring castle? She realized her thoughts were going on a negative path, so she quickly stopped herself from thinking about them. Lilith stifled when he moved forward and grabbed her hands. He didn't even notice her wet eyes, her messy hair, that the veil was gone. Yeah, he never noticed her. She knows his motive for marrying her. The only one who was oblivious to reality was him. Her land he thinks is barren, has monsters ruling over it. Sooner or later, he would know on his own. In no time, she was lying on the bed straight with him hovering over her. Her pupils slightly dilated as her hands shot up to his shoulders. Her eyes flew down when she felt him pulling her dress up, baring her legs. What? He was going straight for it. There was no foreplay and no affection. She swallowed thickly. She had no excuse to say no, and it was their wedding night. She swallowed again when he spread her legs and shifted himself in between her legs. He didn't even ask if she wanted this. What she wanted was to have someone who would listen to, understand her, and wouldn't call her crazy. She breathed when he caressed her thigh, and in one swift move her legs were on his shoulder. What was he doing? She had been having so many heart attacks since this morning, and another one was on its way. She really didn't want this, but she didn't know how to say it. This man talked about nothing. It was a huge day, many things happened, but he had nothing to say, and before she could ask, she was already lying on the bed with her legs bare, spread wide and on his shoulders. Suddenly, that beast flashed in front of her eyes. Why was he here, if he wasn't here to take her? Her thoughts came crashing down when she felt his hand caressing her core, making her flinch. Before he could put her thong aside, a loud knock on the door had both of them flinching. They shared a glance before looking at the door. "Who is it?" Jasper asked. "King, my king." A guard's panic-stricken voice came, and both of them immediately pulled away from each other. Lilith thanked God and took a breath of relief while fixing her dress. Jasper got up and opened the door only to be met by his left hand. Lilith also got up and quietly stared at them. Judging by that man's facial expressions and voice, it seemed like something truly went wrong. "What?" Jasper asked, and what the left hand said next had both of their eyes widening in shock. Without looking back, both the men immediately dashed out of the room. Lilith immediately locked the door and got rid of her wedding dress. As soon as she changed, she also left the room and strode toward the garden of the castle with a heavy heart. She couldn't believe what she heard. She wanted to see herself. Upon reaching the garden, she was met by a crowd of guards surrounding the area with Jasper and his other royal figures. But what she saw next had her pupils dilating and heart rattling. 5 dead bodies were lying lifelessly on the soft grass. 3 of them were their own maids and servants, but the other 2 were the guests. This wasn't the thing that rattled her. It was the 2 familiar small pairs of holes punctured in all of their necks. Chapter 10. All the higher-up royals of the kingdom immediately settled down in the hall to discuss the matter after the bodies were taken away for an examination. There were no injuries on the bodies. They just looked pale, and all of them had those weird holes in their necks. A death pattern, familiar to those that happened in ancient times. Everyone was tense. "I'm afraid it's them." One of the oldest, higher up in them, spoke up. He was an old man with a long white beard. "Them who?" Jasper asked. He was sitting on his throne with a frown on his face. Everyone in the hall knew who the old man was talking about, except the king himself. Those blood-sucking monsters that our ancestors had to deal with. The old man stated, and Jasper's eyes widened. He immediately understood who the old man was talking about. "Vampires?" Jasper asked, and all the heads nodded in sync. Everyone became even more tense. "I don't like to bring this up, but I have to." Another middle-aged man spoke up, gaining everyone's attention. The mysterious fall of the Draven Kingdom could be related to them. Everyone who came here, when asked what was the cause of their fall, all of them had different answers, but the terrified look on their faces were all the same. The middle-aged man disclosed the situation, and everyone was left shocked. "We ended most of them. The remaining ones hid themselves in the shadows of the night. If they are the cause of the fall of Draven Kingdom, and if they are here, then it only means one thing, that this time they are ready to destroy mankind." The old man said, his voice wavering at the end of the sentence. "If they are here, then that means we are on their target," Jasper said while rubbing his chin. "Though, isn't it quite suspicious? Princess Lilith didn't tell anyone about this. Her people's statements were different as well." The middle-aged man retorted, making everyone think about everything from the beginning. "That child must be scared, and why does it look like you're accusing her? She even wanted to go back to her kingdom," the old man said, and the middle-aged man shook his head with a scoff. "Scared to tell the truth. Let me tell you one thing. Princess Lilith was a leader of one of her father's defense units." The middle-aged man disclosed another secret, and all of their jaws slacked. Jasper's gaze narrowed on the middle-aged man. "If you knew all of this, why didn't you disclose it to us earlier?" Jasper asked, and the middle-aged man shook his head. "My king, I thought telling you all of this was of no use. Her kingdom was gone, and she was to marry you," he said, and Jasper's jaw ticked. He started to ponder on the situation, and everything began to seem suspicious. I'm afraid, if what you said is true, then they either did this as a war bell or they are behind Princess Lilith because she survived, the old man said, and Jasper stood up from his throne in frustration. War bell? Where are they even? In hiding? Behind Lilith? What do they want from her? Jasper asked. If they can destroy Draven Kingdom, then we are no exception, but I believe Princess Lilith might hold answers to all of your questions, the old man said, and Jasper harshly ordered the guard to bring Lilith to the hall. I told you to let me tell them the truth. Lilith seethed, pointing at her granny while pacing around the room. Panic was written on her features. If you have told them everything, they have kicked us out, the old granny said, rather calmly. No, I would have at least let them know about their huge existence that destroyed my kingdom. Why would they kick us out on that? Lilith grumbled. She was angry at herself, and then at her granny. But then again, if Jasper knew Lilith's kingdom was taken over by vampires, he wouldn't have married her. He would either have thrown her and her people out or have kept them without marrying Lilith. The second one seemed better for both her and her people. That won't change anything. He is not behind this kingdom. He is behind you, Lilith. Even if you have told them about their existence, they can do nothing about it because we don't know where they are. Even if you have told them about the tale of the fall of your kingdom, it wouldn't stop the monster that's behind you, the granny said, keeping her tone soft. I know. As long as he knows where I am, he will come there. I also remember that I told you that I'm going away in the hiding. I told my people that I'm going back to the kingdom, when in reality, I was just running away because I didn't want that monster to destroy the hand that held on to me, even if that hand was selfish, Lilith declared breathlessly. She was on the verge of losing her mind. You let me go as well, but once you came to know that Jasper proposed to me, you became selfish, Lilith said angrily. Her jaw clenched. Because I saw hope. I saw him saving you from that monster, the old granny said while walking up to Lilith, as she stopped the girl from pacing around the room and grabbed her shoulders, trying to calm her down. Lilith wouldn't blame the old lady for thinking that, because she also thought marrying Jasper would save her from that monster. Lilith shook her head. No one can save me from that crazy lunatic, she said helplessly, tears blurring her sight. I bet he did this because he didn't want Jasper to touch me. Do you see how crazy he is? There might be another reason he did this. It could be war, Lilith said, and pulled out of Granny's hold. I will tell them what happened to us, and that they might be coming here for war. We might not win against them, but we will be able to finish most of them, Lilith said, and walked up to the door. So, you will tell them that he is coming for you? The old granny asked, making Lilith pause as she turned her face to the right side. No, they are coming here for war, Lilith said, and the granny's eyes widened as she hurried up to Lilith and grabbed her arm. Somehow, the granny knew what she was up to. What if they are really here for you, and not for war? The old granny asked, and Lilith took a deep breath before speaking. Why do you worry so much now? You should have let me run away before. Now it's too late, Lilith said. We really thought this marriage could save us, she said, and pulled her arm out of her grip before opening the door and walking out of the room while saying, Seriously, how delusional of us. On her way to the hall, she met a guard who was already coming her way. Since they were calling her, Lilith knew they were already suspicious of them. There was nothing to hide. Chapter 11. The gates of the conference hall were opened as she stepped inside. There was no hesitation in her walk, but from inside she was nervous. All the pair of eyes turned her way. Some of them eyed her suspiciously, and some of them were ashamed of their hostile behavior. This was her first night here as the queen, and she was being brought to the conference hall. This was her wedding night. She was supposed to be in her bedroom instead of being questioned here. But the situation was kinda harsh on them as well. Lilith paused in front of Jasper, who was sitting on his throne. A familiar scene flashed in her eyes upon seeing him sitting on his throne like that, and a zap of shiver ran down her spine. She immediately lowered her gaze and clenched her hands in a tight fist before unclenching them. "You called me," she said softly, and Jasper nodded while standing up as he walked up to her. "I suppose you already know why we called you here," Jasper said, and Lilith took a deep breath before matching his stern gaze. "Yes," she said, and Jasper licked his lower lip before stepping forward closer to her. "Then tell us everything from the beginning," he said, and Lilith looked around before she began telling them everything in a brief summary. "They are after humanity, the mankind that destroyed them. They have now recovered and are after all of us." Lilith said she told them how those monsters destroyed her kingdom in the name of revenge and how they were going to destroy other kingdoms. She skipped the part where the crazy leader of those monsters was chasing her like a deranged man. The part where his obsession led him to the Logon kingdom. "Where do they reside?" Jasper asked. No other men spoke up. They dared not to because she was their queen, but deep down many of them had questions. "I do not know," she said before adding, "They have destroyed many small towns before our kingdom. I remember there was this old lord of a village that came to our kingdom for help." "I see. Have you seen the face of their leader?" he asked, and Lilith paused. "Face. His name is Alara, and he is a crazy lunatic. He has sharp yet thick masculine features with a vertical scar on his right jaw. He looks like a devil, a mentally ill person who smiles while ripping his prey apart. His eyes glow when he sees blood, and they shine in absolute craziness when he sees her. Even the thought of him liking her scares her to oblivion. The thought of him always watching her. He will chase you with a smile so evil you might wish to fall down a cliff rather than die with his hands. And the day he stops smiling will be the day humanity will beg for mercy." "No, I haven't," Lilith lied. "Why didn't you tell us this beforehand?" Jasper asked again. "I was scared. If I told you, you would have kicked me and my people out." She told the truth, and Jasper narrowed his eyes on her. "In short, you wanted us to experience it ourselves?" he asked, and she quickly shook her head. "That is not true. If I wanted bad for you, I wouldn't have told you about anything." Lilith defended herself. "The time is right. It's better than ever to get prepared now for the protection of your kingdom. Might as well take help from the surrounding kingdoms and let them know about their existence," Lilith said, and everyone watched her a little surprised. Jasper didn't like the way she advised him on what to do, that alone in front of everyone. Just because she was the queen now doesn't mean she could take part in any of these situations. He also knows what to do. "I didn't call you here for your advice. Keep it to yourself. Go back to your room now," Jasper said sternly. He didn't even care that his men could clearly listen to his voice. Not only were they shocked, but she was left stunned as well. This was the first time he talked with her like this. She knew he wasn't in a good mood, but she didn't expect him to insult her like that in front of everyone. She swallowed thickly, nodded at him, and turned around, immediately leaving the hall. On her way back to the room, she realized something. Jasper was finally showing his true colors. He didn't like how she advised him in front of everyone. They might have felt weird. But back in her homeland, she used to speak like this alongside her father, the king, and her brother, the crown prince. They used to encourage her, whereas her mother, on the other hand, was truly against it. But this was not her homeland. Upon reaching her room, she found the old granny had fortunately left. Not being able to stand anymore, she slumped down on the bed on her right side and closed her eyes. She missed her family beyond words. Tears trickled down her temple as she recalled her memories with them. She didn't even have any of their remembrances to hold on to. How cruel that monster was to kill off her family and people, and to shamelessly chase her around like a wild animal. She was afraid to fall asleep, terrified that he might show up again, but she was so tired that she drifted off to sleep in no time. The next day, all the remaining guests were informed about the situation in full detail, while the ones who left earlier were sent letters. The news sure rattled them, but being informed beforehand was a relief. Lilith wished her kingdom wasn't the first target. It might not have been, if she hadn't helped that monster that day. She stepped out of his meeting room, feeling extremely heavy-hearted. This morning, Jasper called her to his meeting room and told her that they would be leaving for Castron Kingdom tomorrow. They would take the letter personally to him, since King Ragnar had called them to his land. He would hold a celebration for the newlyweds in his kingdom's castle. He looked excited and eager to go there because Princess Sienna would also join them on the journey. How careless. His kingdom might face those monsters any time, and here he was going there to personally give them the letter, which was obviously an excuse. He wanted to join hands with King Ragnar, and maybe in the future ask for his sister's hand as well. Of course, Lilith had no say in it. He just called her to inform her, not to ask her. She herself also didn't say anything, wondering that he wouldn't like her going against his decision. Just like last time he was mad. King Ragnar, she really didn't want to be near him because he made her feel the same presence of that monster. She feels on edge with his presence around her. With a huff, she descended the stairs but immediately halted on her steps when she heard a few maids gossiping among each other about her. Chapter 12. With a huff, she descended the stairs but immediately halted on her steps when she heard a few maids gossiping among each other. "Yeah, I heard that too," said Maid 1. "I told you Princess Sienna was a better alternative for our queen than that cursed Princess Lilith. Look what bad luck she brought on our kingdom." Another feminine voice came, and Lilith's eyes widened. The news was all over. They already labeled her as a cursed princess. Not only that, even compared her with Sienna. Lilith took a deep breath. Their words hurt her deeply, but instead of stepping back, she stepped forward, coming into their sight. "You heard what?" Lilith asked while walking up to them, and all of them flinched, immediately standing in a proper line and bowing at her. "And my queen?" "I asked something." "What did you hear?" Lilith asked, staring at them blankly. This was the first time she was even conversing properly with the maids of the castle, but the situation was quite bad. They already considered her bad and cursed. If she tries to be nice, they would only consider it fake because their definition of nice was Sienna. We were just talking about the last night incident. One of them spoke up, almost on the verge of crying. If they couldn't face her, why talk behind her back? Lilith didn't even say anything, and they were already like this. She took a deep breath and eyed all three of them properly. They were too beautiful for just maids. "Walls have ears too, they're cursed too," Lilith said, and all of them shared a similar glance expressing "we are done." She wanted to scare them more, but she just decided to walk away from there, leaving them behind in confusion. The next day arrived, and the caravan left for the Castron Kingdom in the early morning. The caravan included Princess Sienna and some of her personal royal guards from the Castron Kingdom, who were always around her. It included the main guest, no one other than the newly wedded couple, along with the old granny and a few of their servants with the special protection unit that would safely lead them to the Castron Kingdom before the night falls. The Logon and Castron Kingdoms didn't have much of a distance between them. Lilith took a deep breath. She wanted to ride the horse, but she got stuck in the carriage because of her so-called husband and granny, who cared a little too much about their reputation. Their reputation would crumble if she rode a horse. She didn't expect this from Jasper. This man was really showing his true colors. Even last night, he didn't show up in their room because he was busy settling all the things down in the kingdom before leaving for the Castron Kingdom. Lilith continued to look out of the window with her chin resting on her palm. Her sight was blocked by huge trees, and she couldn't have a clear look at the beautiful blue sky. She turned her face to the left and saw the old granny sleeping with her head on Lilith's shoulder. With a sigh, she slowly turned her gaze in front and stared at Princess Sienna, who was sitting in front of her, busy reading a book. Usually, this young lady speaks a lot, but right now she was utterly silent. Maybe the book was too interesting. Lilith wanted to start a conversation because she was bored, but at the same time, she didn't want to disturb her. But before she could look away, she unfortunately made eye contact with Sienna. Lilith noticed something. Sienna smiled a lot and looked soft, but when she didn't smile, she looked exactly the way she was looking at Lilith right now. Slightly terrifying. Sienna slowly closed the book, maintaining eye contact with Lilith, forcing the girl to flutter her gaze away for a second because the young lady in front really needed to smile at this point. "Princess Lilith," Sienna called her, and Lilith lashed her gaze back on her form. "Yes?" Lilith asked politely, waiting for Sienna to speak up. "Are you on your menstrual cycle?" Sienna asked, and Lilith's pupils slightly widened. She slowly raised her chin from her palm, her lips slightly parted as she stared at Sienna a little stunned. "Ah yes, my cycle started at midnight," Lilith said, and Sienna made an O face, finally passing her a smile. "How did you know?" Lilith asked, and Sienna shrugged while rubbing the tip of her nose with her finger. "I have a great sense of smell," Sienna declared proudly, and Lilith raised her brows at Sienna with a little smile on her face while nodding. Sienna's smile slowly faded away, but Lilith didn't notice it as she praised the young lady. "That's a great talent from God," Lilith complimented her, finally noticing how Sienna was staring at her more intensely, almost scaring the living daylights out of Lilith, as the princess moved a little back. Something was wrong with these siblings. She was trying to be positive about all of this, but everything around her was giving her a negative energy. Her gut feeling was telling her that going to the Castran Kingdom would only add more hardships and suffering to her life. But she couldn't do anything about it. "Is something wrong?" Lilith asked lowly, her voice cracking in the middle. "No, I was just wondering," Sienna said. She looked in a daze. "If you don't mind me asking, what are you thinking about?" Lilith asked softly and politely, and the girl answered in a daze. "There is no doubt as to why he's so overly obsessed with you. You're so kind and soft, I feel sorry for you," Sienna said, and Lilith's smile dropped instantly as she stared at Sienna a little stunned. "What?" Lilith asked, and Sienna blinked several times, finally out of her trance of thoughts as she just realized what she said. I was talking about Jasper," Sienna said, and Lilith's frown deepened, making Sienna realize that the excuse was almost third-dimensional. Jasper, and obsessed with Lilith. She needed to replace Jasper's name with that monster. Seriously, where did she even get this idea from? Lilith said nothing to that, and just passed her a tight-lipped fake smile. Denying this might raise questions in Sienna's head. They went on for a while before resting. They rested for half an hour before they began the journey again. Since this time Sienna was sitting on the window side, Lilith noticed how Jasper kept coming up to the window. Lilith asked Sienna if she was uncomfortable with her blood smell. She'd step out and ride the horse, even if it wasn't a good action to commit in her menstrual cycle. Sienna denied. Soon the blue sky was covered with night fury, and they all arrived at the Castran Kingdom. Knock, knock. A knock resonated in the room, followed by a wavering voice. "My king, they have arrived." The room fell in silence, but the bed made a slight creaking sound soon after as he stepped down and fixed his robe. Raked a hand down his long dark silver hair while walking up to the window. He put his hand on the wall beside the window and leaned forward. A woman could be seen lying on the bed behind him. She was on her stomach, and she was fully dressed, but her clothes were disheveled and her eyes were wide open. Her skin color had gone pale, and blood had stopped pouring out from the 2 puncture holes in her neck. He stared out of the window. An evil smirk made its way on his lips as he poked the inside of his cheek with his tongue in utter excitement. She was right in front of his sight. His eyes traveled with each step of hers that she took towards his castle and her cage. His jaw twitched upon seeing Jasper right beside her, the vertical scar on his jaw flexing. "It's time to listen to the master."
Want to win a free bundle of 3 amazing audiobooks? Comment Dark Fantasy below for a chance to win. No limit on entries. Comment as many times as you like. I will select 5 random comments. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for new books every weekend.
Chapter 13. Lilith looked around the castle and was left a little surprised. It was a castle built in the ancient times. It had a peculiar and very complicated structure, but at the same time, it looked ethereal and something adventurous and exciting to live in. In every era, the king rebuilds the castle to his liking. Thus, the structure keeps changing according to the most famous structure that goes around every kingdom. Most of the castle in this era looks very alike because of that, but this one looked like it hadn't been changed for a long time. It makes this castle look unique. All of them stepped inside the castle, and the inside of the castle was even more ethereal yet perplexing. If you get lost here, you'll barely find your way out. It wasn't rebuilt from the inside either. It made her feel like she was in old times. Even Jasper complimented the castle. While they were making their way to the main hall, they came face to face with the person she least wanted to see, but she was obviously asking for the impossible. King Ragnar came from the other side. His presence was extraordinary as always. He was dressed in all black with his silver hair braided from both sides, from roots to the tip, while the hair in between remained untouched, mixing with the braided ones. This man's genes were truly out of the ordinary. His face was covered. His people have seen his face, and he probably roams around here without a mask, but since they were here, he kept his mask on. Lilith immediately hid herself behind Jasper. Her heartbeat turned wild, but she tried to appear as calm as possible. She heard a very familiar voice which almost made her flinch, but then she realized that the voice belonged to King Ragnar. Her palms started to sweat. Even his voice sounded the same as that monster. Jasper and Ragnar professionally greeted each other. Lilith kept her gaze rooted on the ground, finding it very fascinating to stare at because she was as nervous as ever. A sudden silence surrounded them, making Lilith look up, and her heart almost came into her mouth upon making eye contact with King Ragnar. Jasper had stepped aside for God knows how long, and she didn't even notice it. "Princess Lilith, we are pleased that you blessed our homeland with your exquisite presence." Ragnar greeted her in his deep and smooth voice as he stepped forward and raised his hand. Lilith hesitantly placed her hand on his fingertips. She was left stunned and scared because of their hand size. This man was a giant. Truly out of the ordinary. He kissed the back of her hand with his clothed lips, and Lilith swore he squeezed her hand before letting it go. He passed her a glance before turning his back to her. "I'm sure you all must be very tired from the journey. Honor me to make you feel at home," Ragnar said, and nodded at Sienna before he and Jasper walked away. Sienna showed Lilith her room and told her to freshen up for dinner that was going to be held in the main dining hall. Lilith looked around the room. It was pretty much similar to the room she had in the Logon castle, but the question was, where were Jasper's belongings? Only her belongings were placed in the corner of the room, and the bed was also not master size. What does this mean? Was the newly wedded couple separated? Strangely, yes. With this thought on her mind, Lilith got freshened up and wore a new dress. Once she was ready, she settled down on the sofa in the corner of the room and continued to think about everything that was happening. She had so much on her mind that her head might explode. Shaking her head, she stood up and stepped out of the room, only to be met by a maid who was standing there waiting for her to come out so she could guide her to the dining hall. Lilith would have walked out earlier if she knew a maid was waiting for her. The maid bowed at her and politely asked Lilith to follow her. Lilith began to follow her while looking around the interior of the castle. They took many turns and paths, and this alone was enough to let her assumption come true about this castle. Once you get lost, you'll come out when your kidneys get shrunk. Lilith's eyes unconsciously fall on the maid walking before her. She was very small and timid. She had this innocence on her face which indicated that she was very young, but what caught Lilith's eyes was her nape. Her eyes zeroed on her nape, and her pupils dilated when she saw a red mark on her neck. It was as if her neck was chained with chains or a collar. She fastened her pace and began to walk beside the maid. The little girl innocently looked at her before dropping her gaze again. Lilith was so busy analyzing her that she didn't realize that she was looking like a creep. The girl took an abrupt turn to the left, leaving Lilith slightly behind, but she strides up beside her again. She was curious about that mark on her neck. Do all maids and servants have them here? She was too late to ask her the question, because they reached the dining hall where everyone was already waiting for her. Lilith settled down on the chair that the servant pulled for her. Lilith looked in front, and something ticked in her. Why Jasper and Sienna were sitting together instead of Jasper and Lilith? They looked like the newly wedded couple. What was even happening? It looked like Sienna was trying to give a full line of path to Jasper so he could walk up to her easily. Even her brother looked involved. Lilith looked to her left and saw King Ragnar sitting on his master chair in the middle. Jasper was on his left side with Sienna, while Lilith was on his right side. This neglectful husband of hers didn't even look her way. While the man who was a complete stranger was staring at her as if she was his meal and not the steak on his plate. She could feel Ragnar's gaze all too clear on her. This man didn't have good intentions for her. Lilith could see it, she could feel it. He had his eyes on her all the time. She felt nervous under his gaze. Couldn't Jasper see that Ragnar was looking at her with weird intentions? No, he doesn't even care. Lilith tried to ignore all the illiterate behaviors that were going on around her while trying to focus on the maid who was serving her food. Lilith's eyes went towards her nape, and strangely enough, there was no mark on her pale neck. Lilith licked her lips and began to eat silently while the couple in front of her happily talked to each other and Ragnar. She felt extremely lonely. If Jasper was to do this, why did he even bring her here? Formality. She quickly finished her food and stood up from her chair. She gave them an excuse that she was tired and wanted to retire to bed as soon as possible. She immediately left the dining hall and was led back to her guest room by the same young girl. She was in no mood to inquire about that mark around her neck. It was not her business. Being nosy had made her pay great consequences. She wanted to see her old granny, but only God knows in which corner she was of this castle. Once she reached her room, she immediately fell down on the bed, bouncing a little. She took off her shoes, let her hair loose, and laid down in the same dress. She had no power to change. She covered herself with the duvet and closed her eyes, blocked all her thoughts away, as she prayed for a good night's sleep before dozing off, but little did she know that the devil was to haunt her before the sun rose. Chapter 14. In the middle of the night. Lilith tossed and turned on the bed with a frown on her face. She was sleeping just fine, until she turned to her right side while half asleep and began to feel uncomfortable and very cold. She pulled the duvet up to her head and curled herself in a ball, but that didn't help at all. Why was she even feeling cold when all the windows were closed along with the door? Even though the candles were still lit, she didn't blow them off before sleeping because she was too scared to sleep in the dark ever since weird incidents started to happen to her. With a frown on her face, she slowly blinked her eyes open and got on her elbow. She looked around the room with squinted eyes and realized that the candles were no longer enlightening the room. The room was completely indulged in darkness, and just a little moonlight was coming through the slit between the curtains. With a groan, she dropped back on the cushion only for her body to completely freeze. From the corner of her eye, she could see someone sitting on the sofa. Lilith felt her blood going cold, and her body going stiff like a statue. Her wide eyes stared up at the ceiling. Her heart began to beat at an abnormal pace, and her palms that were in a fist began to sweat with a little tremor. She couldn't believe it. He even made his way here. Tears blurred her sight as she slowly turned her head to the right where the sofa was. She flinched badly and immediately sat up straight, her body facing the sofa as she began to scoot back on the bed, on the verge of having a panic attack. She couldn't see his face, but she could see his body. His posture was screaming a totally different language from the current situation. That body language of his was calm, yet predatory. Lilith almost fell off the bed. She didn't realize when she turned around and got up, only to fall down on the floor because her legs got entangled in the duvet. A painful hiss left her lips when she sprained her ankle. Tisk 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 tisk. Lilith's breath stifled upon hearing that. The fear that was consuming her at the moment was much more than the pain in her ankle. Without another thought, she stood up and limped towards the door. And just like that, she found herself running and limping through the maze of corridors in the middle of the night. Barefoot. Where was everyone? She couldn't find a single maid or servant, not even a guard. She didn't know where Jasper or Granny's room was, and for some reason she kept coming across the same vase, the same tree that could be seen outside through the open corridor. There was no guard outside either. Besides the vase, there was a huge door that kept coming into her sight again and again. It was really suspicious. Finding not even a single soul, and coming across the same tree, gate, and vase again and again. Lilith slowly halted beside the gate, huffing and puffing with her hands on her knees. She was trying to catch her breath. Standing up straight, she wiped her tears and pinched herself because she thought this only happens in dreams, but no, it was all really happening with her. She was lost, and kept running in the same corridor, again and again without even realizing it because she was too scared. Fear took over her, and her mind almost stopped working there. She slowly turned around while panting, and a zap of horror ran down her spine when she saw nothing but darkness in the corridor. With a small, shaky breath, she immediately turned towards the gate. She was expecting the gate to be chained, but fortunately it wasn't. She pushed open the gate with much effort, and immediately closed it as well with the same effort without looking around her once. She was tense as ever, as she slowly turned around and attached her back to the gate, trying to calm herself down. She opened her eyes, and her pupils dilated when she realized that she was in the conference hall that was surrounded by candles everywhere, subsiding her fear a little. Even the huge lamps on the ceiling were glowing, making the fancy surroundings more than clear to one's eye. With a deep breath, she began to walk further. Royal seats were placed on either side for the respected higher-ups. Her eyes went up towards the throne in the middle of the hall, and her heart skipped a beat in fear. What kind of a throne was this? The stairs had a red carpet resting on it, as it led to the throne on the top. The seat had red velvet clothing, but the exterior of the throne was huge spiky brown-colored wood. One could easily die from that sharp tip of that spiky wood, and one would be torn to shreds if he was pushed against it. The throne was surrounded by it, from bottom to top. It looked really exotic, and matched King Ragnar's personality. There were 2 pillars on either side of the throne. Something was written on them, but Lilith clearly couldn't understand the language carved on them. Maybe the language was ancient like the castle as well. She flinched, and her heart almost came to her mouth when a sharp gust of wind caressed her back. She abruptly turned around, and looked here and there to see from where the wind came. It touched her, but didn't blow off the candles. To her horror, there was no window in the hall. Goosebumps raised on her skin, and she looked towards the gate, ready to leave, but what she heard next had her completely pausing on her steps as her whole being froze in sheer terror. My little Missy. Lilith wanted to breathe, but she couldn't. It's been a long time. She wanted to run away, but she couldn't. Her body was stiff, and her breath was stifled. She immediately shook her head, and consoled herself by taking this all as a dream. With so much dug-up courage, she slowly turned on her bare foot and looked up at the throne. Her lips parted with a tremble, her eyes going wide in shock as she stared at the man sitting on the throne, horrified out of her wits upon seeing that all-too-familiar face. Ilara. She whispered under her breath, and he smirked at her, flexing his dimples. I like to hear that name from your lips, but unfortunately my real name is not Ilara. It's Ragnar, Lilith. His name from her mouth sends shivers down her spine. Ragnar? Lilith stuttered, her orbs throbbing in terror. Her mind refused to believe, but her eyes saw otherwise. He was sitting on his throne, his legs carelessly spread open. His right elbow on the armrest of the throne with his right hand, which was turned into a fist, was propping up his cheek. He had long dark silver hair like King Ragnar. He was wearing the same black suit that King Ragnar was wearing today, but his eyes were no longer cold. His eyes had that all-too-familiar evil and amused glint that the monster always had in his eyes. His nose was the same as that monster. His lips were the same as that monster, and even the vertical scar on his jaw was there. King Ragnar was Alara all this time. Alara helped her with that book. He was staring at her through the window. He kissed her hand 2 times. He was in her room on her wedding night before leaving, and he was staring at her at the dinner table. It was him, the nightmare she feared all this time. Chapter 15. Oh, to that unfortunate day. If she were to know, she would have wished death to consume her. Oh, to that kindness of hers, that led nothing but misery upon her. I've missed you. His voice held nothing but malicious intentions within its tone. He liked the way her face morphed into sheer terror. He liked the way her body trembled as she stepped back in horror. His gaze caressed her form from head to toe, ever so slowly before meeting her terrified eyes. "Did you miss me?" he asked with a psychotic smile on his face, and a gasp of horror raked through her body. She just couldn't believe what she was seeing. She knew something was wrong with him. She knew it, yet she couldn't do anything about it. She took a step back, holding her tears back, and with much courage she narrowed her eyes at him, making his mouth turn into an O, as if he was very much amused by that glare of hers. "Stop looking at me with those eyes unless you want to get FCKED, because you see, I'm turned on by that look," he said in a cool, suggestive tone in the beginning, but his tone turned into a low grunt by the end of the sentence. Lilith's heart was on the verge of bursting as her glare wavered. She took 2 steps back while shaking her head at him. "The arsehole." She cursed at him, turned around and began to run towards the gate while half limping. A cry left her lips when she heard his psychotic laughter right behind her. It was so terrifyingly malicious. She wanted the darkness to consume her so she wouldn't have to see what happened to her next. There was no hope of getting away from him, yet she tried. It was a play for him. It was a nightmare for her. Upon reaching the gate, she tried to open it, but to her horror, it wouldn't even rattle, even when she was applying her full power to shake it. A whimper left her lips as she began to bang on the gate with her fist, yelling for help as if anyone could save her from the monster. Her banging slowly slowed down as she stared at the huge shadow reflecting on the door with a horrified look on her face. Everything stilled around her, even her breath. He was right behind her. She squealed in terror and abruptly turned around, attaching herself completely to the gate behind her as she stared up at him with wide eyes and heavy breathing. Seeing him up close made things even worse. Her head was throbbing, her gaze turned blurry with tears, but darkness wouldn't just take her. She could feel her pulse rapidly in her tightly fisted hands. He was a dangerously handsome man, but upon seeing him up close, she saw nothing but a monster. What do you want? Why can't you just leave me alone? Why do you keep making me regret my kindness? She asked while stuttering, barely catching her breath. She was frustrated by all of this. I like the way you rant," he mused, leaning forward as he put his left hand on the gate above her head while his right hand took a strand of her hair between his fingers, and he began to twirl that strand around his finger. Her words didn't matter at all. Her frustration was nothing but ranting to him. She looked at her hair strand between his fingers. "I hate you," she said as a big fat tear rolled down her eye. All of a sudden, he grabbed her waist with his left hand and pulled her to his chest. She immediately tried to move back, but could she even struggle against him, let alone fight? She was trembling like a leaf upon feeling that huge hand on her back. It was definitely him that day in the corridor. The time she bumped into someone. Her eyes turned towards her right, where she found him intertwining his fingers with hers, as both of their arms were raised. Hers was extra stretched. The hand size alone scared her. He wasn't wearing his gloves, so his sharp long nails were on display. In a second, he caged her and she felt suffocated. "Say that again," he whispered in her ear in a demanding tone. Mentally ill, deranged man. When she didn't say anything and tried to struggle out of his hold, his grip tightened even more on her, almost knocking her breath away. "I won't repeat myself," he rasped, and she flinched, immediately blurting out those 3 words dipped in helplessness, hatred, and desperation. I hate you, she said. Again. He demanded. I hate you, she repeated herself once again. She badly flinched when he began to laugh hysterically, taking her downright off guard. At least you feel something about me. That alone excites me, he muttered, and began to walk backward. Her feet were no longer touching the ground, as he was effortlessly holding her up. A tear slipped down her eye, and she gasped when he licked that tear up and grunted in satisfaction. His smile suddenly dropped, as he stared at her dead right in the eyes. Are you trying to seduce me with those tears? He asked, and her crying stifled as small sobs raked through her body. She remembered how he loved to see her crying. If I saw another tear, I'd waste no second to rail you up right here in the middle of the hall. Remember, I don't go back on my words, he said in a threatening tone, his voice as deep as his gaze. She completely stiffened, but couldn't control her little sobs. She didn't even realize when he settled down on his throne with her on his lap. He wrapped his right arm around her waist and brought her closer, putting his chin on her shoulder as he took a deep sniff of her scent. Fucking delicious, he said, and she closed her eyes shut. Let's have a little talk now, shall we? A talk. This was enough to indicate that he was on to no good, and after tonight, fate had promised to get worse. Chapter 16. Let's have a little talk now, shall we? He said while caressing her back in a sensual manner. Lilith had her head turned to the left, with her eyes completely shut. Her chest continued to heave up and down, as she was unable to control the sobs that shook her body. She flinched when he grabbed her hair from her right shoulder and pushed it back, putting his chin on her shoulder as his cold breath caressed her neck, making her shiver. Fucking look at me when I talk to you, he rasped, his hold tightening on her waist. Lilith swallowed thickly, and with a deep inhale she blurted out. You are hard to look at. An eerie silence surrounded them, only her deep breathing could be heard. No answer or reaction from him, had her toes curling in fear, as she slowly and hesitantly turned her face to the side to look at him. She shouldn't have dug her own grave when she was to look at him anyway. His face was deadly serious, and his eyes were dark, but all of that lasted for a second in front of her gaze, because as soon as she made eye contact with him, he passed her an eye smile, flexing his dimples, instantly changing his expression. If he was a normal person, she would have thought the smile was extremely charming, but all she saw was a psychotic smile. He had a sadistic and psychotic personality. Since I'm in a good mood, I'll let that slide, he said, and looked into her eyes. She looked away for a second before matching his gaze again, and her terrified eyes kept doing it, because she just couldn't look him in the eyes. Those orbs held the screams of those whom he killed mercilessly. So tell me, what was the reason for marrying that peasant mortal when you clearly knew that I fucking own you, huh? He asked casually, and Lilith's brows twitched. She instantly looked away. Was she already obeying him without a fight? What was she doing? His fear sure made her timid, but she just couldn't digest the fact of obeying this monster like a puppet who killed her family and people. Lilith knew it would bring more disaster. If she obeys him like a puppet, she'd get ruined. If she doesn't obey him like a puppet, she'd get ruined. Both had the same conclusion. This wasn't like her. She knew she had lost herself long ago because of him, but the old Lilith was still there. Her ego was still not rattled. Otherwise she wouldn't have married Jasper either, in order to get away from the monster even though it was useless. She was still desperate to get away. She still had emotions running in her. She wouldn't obey him. He has nothing dear of hers to destroy now. The only thing he could destroy was her, and she was already eradicated long ago. His fear in her only made her weak. What if she just stops fearing him? Though it was impossible, still. He'd beat her or kill her. What could he do other than that? Just turning to look at him made her obey him, and that alone was a trigger point. It changed something in her right then and there. She'd shake in fear, she'd cry in terror, but she would never obey him. The only thing he wanted to satisfy himself was for her to give in to his terror and obey him. "As I, if you don't know why I am married him," she stammered out, and his low, throaty chuckle invaded her ears, making goosebumps rise on her skin. Her hands that were on her lap turned into tight fists. She just wanted to punch him. "I don't understand. Why would one enjoy tormenting someone weaker than them?" she asked bitterly, but her voice was wavering in fear. They are just sick in the brain, don't worry, they know it as well and enjoy it to the fullest," he said ever so slowly. He knew what he was. "I feel pleased with your question, ask more," he said in his deep voice and a demanding tone. Lilith abruptly looked at him. Her terrified expression morphed in disgust, and it ticked something inside him. She could look at him with only 3 emotions in her eyes: hate, fear, or love. Something more was a trigger point for him. He'd make sure she only knows these 3 emotions or no emotion at all when she looks at him. "Drop that fucking expression right now," he said dead seriously, and she frowned at him. "Or what?" she asked, and he paused for a second there, until a wide smirk caressed his lips, taking her aback as she began to struggle out of his grip, but he pulled her closer. "Are we finally playing this play?" he asked, and her frown deepened. Her heart was about to pierce out of her chest. This man was truly crazy and beyond her understanding. "Let me go. I'm someone else's wife now," she squealed, and the next moment a yelp left her lips when he grabbed a fistful of her hair and yanked her head back, exposing her swan-like neck to his hungry and lustful eyes. "Someone else's wife now? Doesn't matter. I can make you my whore anyway," he rasped. Lilith flinched when she felt his cold lips tracing her warm skin. A new wave of terror struck her as she trembled. Was he going to suck her blood? She still remembers how painful it was, even though it has been 2 years now. "Let me go," she croaked out breathlessly. A gasp left Lilith's lips, and she began to struggle wildly in his hold when he gave her an open-mouthed kiss on her throat and licked that area with a slight suction. "You know, the first time I saw you," he paused and looked down at her slightly revealed cleavage. He raised his free hand and brought it near his exposed heaven. His fingers caressed that line ever so sensually, making her flinch badly, and due to her wild struggling, his nail accidentally pierced her soft skin. All this happened while he was speaking casually in his deep voice and calm tone. "I was stunned by your beauty, bravery, and kindness. I thought you believed too much in this world, its people and their kindness. Your father and ancestors created that atmosphere around you, and you became exactly like the place you were born in, and those same people did the opposite to my people. I believed too much in hatred and negativity. They made me what I am today." His pupils dilated, and he halted his words instantly when he saw the drop of blood on her fair and soft skin.
Want to win a free bundle of 3 amazing audiobooks? Comment Dark Fantasy below for a chance to win. No limit on entries. Comment as many times as you like. I will select 5 random comments. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for new books every weekend.
Chapter 17. His pupils dilated, and he halted his words instantly when he saw the drop of blood on her fair and soft skin. "Tisk, tisk, tisk, see what your neglectful behavior did," he said, tightening his hold on her to stop her from struggling, as he brought his nail that pierced her skin up to his lips, licking it. He noticed how his fear made her flinch more than the physical pain caused her. Nothing was more satisfying than this. "Your blood, too, is as fascinating as you," he whispered, ever so slowly. He wrapped his arm around her waist and tightened his hold on her hair as he pulled her head back, arching her chest more to himself. A sob left her lips as she tried to struggle, but her arms were tied down by his arm that was wrapped around her waist. A helpless tear trickled down her temple, and she shut her eyes. A gasp left her lips upon feeling his cold tongue right on her exposed cleavage as he licked all those blood droplets. Such taste makes me only demand more," he said, making her blood almost go ice cold. He let go of her hair and straightened her up. The tears that were trickling down her temple were now kissing her cheeks, but she immediately stopped them from falling, because now he could clearly see her face. "Oh my, I didn't even do anything, and look at you, trembling like a leaf. That's so unlike you, you know that just makes me look like a bad guy." Just as he mused this out, she looked up at him. No, she was glaring at him, and he just passed her a crazy smirk full of menacing intentions. "It's not like I sucked your blood or fucked you raw, huh?" he asked, and she just kept glaring at him. "For a vampire king, you sure have a lot of time on your sleeve to chase me like that. Are you sure you have no motive for that? I don't believe you do this just for mere satisfaction." She gritted out in a gur tone, and he watched her amused before bursting into hysterical laughter. That wasn't a joke. He was just crazy. He stopped laughing and cleared his throat. "You look like someone I know," he said dead seriously, and Lilith frowned. "Who?" she asked seriously, thinking he was serious as well. "From 2 years ago," he said, but when she passed him no reaction but only a look of hatred, he immediately dropped his smile, changing his expression instantly as he stared at her sharply. "I'm bored. Shall we play then?" he asked, and her pupils dilated upon realizing that he was up to no good. She tried to struggle out of his grip, and he let her go. She stumbled out of his lap, and immediately descended the stairs with a painful expression on her face due to her sprained ankle. Once she got down, she faced him. "I'm not asking you, though," he said, and her heart began to run on another level of pace to the point that she thought she would have a heart attack right on the spot. Run as fast as you can. Hide wherever you want, and if I catch you in 5 minutes, then." He covered half of his lower face and smirked at her. "Then I have to decide if I want to suck your blood, or to fuck you, or both. It depends on how fast I find you," he said, and she shook her head at him while stepping back. "You can find me anyway, why this?" she asked in a wavering tone, and he nodded. "I'm glad to know that you at least know that you can't hide from me. We are doing this, just like I said, I'm bored," he said, and terror took over her in no time. "I'm not for your entertain. 1, 2, 3. He slowly stood up and began to count while descending the stairs with a powerful gait, knocking the breath out of her system as she began to step backward, staring at him horrified. He really does what he says. The punishments, he said, were worse after worse. 8, 9. He kept stepping forward, and she kept stepping backward. He wasn't stopping. "Asshole." She cussed at him under her breath, before turning around and running towards the gate. Fortunately, the gate opened. He didn't keep it locked, unlike his wicked personality, and even after doing all of this mental torture with her, he would call this a fair game. The audacity of this monster was beyond for a man with dignity. She stepped out of the hall and began to run in the dark corridor. Tears blurred her sight, but she wiped them away. He knew she wouldn't give in just like that, but he also liked to watch her helplessly run around like a fool. She was going to be on the receiving end one way or another. Her foot has started to hurt, and a few of her soul areas were scraped as well. She ran breathlessly and tried to open several doors, but all of them were locked. Oh, where were the people of this castle? Were they involved in this as well? Of course it was his castle, and she was doomed. The whole of mankind was, only if what she was thinking about was right. The biggest kingdoms of the kingdoms, the Castron kingdom, belonged to those blood-sucking monsters. Since there was no door open, but only the pathway messing with her senses, she looked outside. There was no guard. How about she just leaves the castle? She knew she couldn't find the way out from within the castle, so she decided to take the risk and slide down the thick root of the tree that was wrapped around the edge of the corridor in a decorative manner. With a deep breath, she took the risk. She was once a woman of blade and war, so climbing down wasn't really hard for her. She chose the thickest root, the one that looked strongest, to hold onto her weight. She noticed how badly she was trembling. It was a bad move when she looked up at the corridor of the castle, right in the middle of her struggling to get down on the ground. A gasp left her lips, and she immediately crouched down and covered her mouth to stop the cry when she saw his silhouette taking a turn in the corridor. He was prowling around, lurching in the shadows of the pathway, looking for his prey with a sadistic smile on his face as he was humming a whistle. She began to tremble beyond control. The courage that she stuffed in her mind while sitting right on his lap all blew away when she witnessed how he was looking around for her. She cried out. She didn't want him to see her like this. If he spotted her here, she'd die of a panic attack. She quickly got down and dusted her hands off. Her palms and feet were all scratched, but she felt nothing other than extreme fear. She immediately turned around, grabbed her dress, and began to run while still hiding within the trees and bushes, instead of taking the middle clear pathway to reach the main gates faster. She didn't want him to see her. Just as this thought crossed her mind, something clicked inside her head. He would find her anyway. Wasn't it better to be on the clear path than this forest-type area? Just as this idea ran through her mind. Whistle, whistle. She instantly froze. The whistle came from right above her. Her throbbing orb slowly traveled up to the tree, and there he was standing on the tree, staring at her with an evil smirk kissing his already devilish features. Found ya? He rasped, taking her breath away. Chapter 18. Found ya? He rasped, taking her breath away. Lilith shrieked in horror and started to move back, but soon a groan left her lips when she stepped on the rock with the foot that was already sprained and harshly fell down on her butt. A painful yelp left her lips. Tisk, 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 why must you injure my property like this? He asked casually, with his sturdy arms crossed over his sturdy chest. Lilith passed him a tearful glare and tried to get up to run away again, but what he said next had her freezing on her spot. If you want your punishment to be the third option, then you can run again, he said sternly, and her pupils dilated. Then what was the option he caught her on? Oh, it's the second one, fucking you, he said, stressing on the last two words in a rough voice, and her heart leapt to her mouth. This was going to happen anyway. He was just going to do what he wanted. Everything that he was doing was his own sadistic desire. Lilith shook her head at him and abruptly stood up. Without caring about the harsh pain in her ankle, she ran out of that forest area and began to run on the clear path in the middle towards the gates while screaming breathlessly for help. She was getting tired, but she just wouldn't reach the gates. The gates seemed so out of reach. Why couldn't she reach it? They walked into the castle from this pathway, and it was only half she ran up till now to reach the gate. Maybe if she went out of the castle, he would lose track of her, and that was why she just couldn't reach the gates. She turned to look back at the castle, but what she saw next had a cry leaving her lips instead of the word help. He was prowling towards her in the middle of the pathway. A little smirk plastered on his lips as he continued to approach her like a predator while she ran for her life. A cry left Lilith's lips as she turned back in front and fastened her pace while praying to God to save her. She ran and ran to the point her feet gave up on her, and she fell down on the pathway, huffing and puffing, struggling to breathe properly as she stared at the gates with teary eyes. Were the nights ever this long? She dreaded to look back, but she did, slowly and hesitantly. With her trembling hands, she wiped her forehead and looked around with a little frown on her face. He was nowhere. Where did he go? She cleared her dried throat and turned her face back in front, looking at the ground in a daze because she was tired, but what she saw in front of her eyes had her heartbeat pausing and her blood going cold. Two black shiny boots were right in front of her eyes. Her wide eyes snapped up and met his amused ones. He was crouching down right in front of her, flexing his dimples with that devilish smirk that was settled down permanently on his features. A gasp left Lilith's lips and she began to scoot back. He stood up to his mighty height with a tisk sound leaving his lips. Fuck, you did great. He complimented her desperation. Are you a child? Look what you did to yourself. He rasped, and Lilith's jaw twitched at his sheer audacity. As if he wasn't the one who did this to her. She turned around and stood up, but before she could take a step further, he was right behind her. Stop running, you are pissing me off. Trust me, you wouldn't like to see that side. He whispered in her ear, and before she could say something, he put his right hand on her mouth, muffling her words. "Quiet down," he gruffed out as he wrapped his left arm around her waist, making sure her arms were also caged in his hold as he picked her up and started to walk. Lilith began to thrash wildly. Her horrified eyes looked around to spot a single soul, but there was none. She was on the verge of losing herself into insanity. She couldn't free her arms, she felt like she was caged. The suffocation due to his hand on her mouth had her the worst because she was already breathless. "Close your eyes, darling. I don't want you going blind so soon," he whispered in her ear, and just as he said this, he took a step back, and Lilith immediately understood that he was about to use his powers. She instantly shut her eyes, and what she felt next was hell. He finally slowed down and began to walk. She felt nauseous, dizzy, out of breath. Vision went blank for a while, even though she closed her eyes to avoid this from happening. Lilith heard the door opening and closing, and that was when she instantly went on high alert. She snapped her eyes open and began to look around while struggling. It was a master-size, luxurious room. He brought her to his room. He really does what he says. She was terrified out of her wits. The room had a dark aura. It had a black and red surrounding. The bedsheet was red, the huge round bed was black. The curtains were black. It looked suffocating but matched his personality. Lilith's eyes widened when he threw her on the bed, messing up her system even more, as she was on the verge of losing her memories, but for the better. A painful frown was kissing her features as her eyes were shut close. "Resembles a kitten," he whispered to himself while looking at her face. That face, that personality of hers was the cause of her misery. It made him remember things he refused to forget anyway. Though those memories were vivid, but they were also as clear as ever in front of his eyes in her form. Lilith immediately got on her elbows and looked at him. She found him blankly staring at her, and that stare wasn't helping her condition at all. But all of a sudden that blank stare was wiped off of his face, as the side of his lips curved up in a smirk. "Now shall we begin?" Chapter 19. "Now shall we begin?" he asked enthusiastically. A creepy smile kissed his features as he stressed the word "begin," and Lilith's soul almost left her body. She immediately shook her head and began to scoot backward on her elbow, but a painful yelp left her lips when he grabbed her already bruised ankle and yanked her down on the bed. Amidst her pain, she heard him say, "Pardon me, I wasn't aware of your injury." And the very next moment, her bruised ankle was gently held within his huge hand as he raised her leg up and pressed his soft and cold lips on her throbbing ankle, making her flinch. Her eyes snapped open as a thought crossed her mind, and without a second thought, she abruptly pulled her ankle out of his hold and was about to kick him right in the face with the same bruised feet, but to her unfortunate fate, he ended up dodging that kick. "Stop pretending as if you care." She seethed these words while trying to kick him, but in a swift move, he grabbed her ankle in a ruthless grip, making her gasp out in pain. Her tearful eyes met his cold ones. He looked pissed. All that smug look was replaced with exasperation. "You dare fucking doubt me," he said, squeezing her ankle even more, to the point she couldn't suppress the cry of pain anymore. He slowly loosened his grip on her ankle and moved down while letting go of her leg. Her face was turned to the left as tears trickled down her temple. Some of her hair strands were stuck to her wet forehead. Her chest was heaving with each of her wavering sobs. All of a sudden, he let go of her leg, and she stiffened when she felt his cold breath on her cheek. He grabbed her jaw in a firm grip and made her face him. Her hands shot up to his chest, trying to maintain an appropriate distance between them. Her teary and helpless eyes matched his cold ones. "When I give you love, you receive it with no damn objection, do you get it?" he asked lowly in his deep and gruff voice. Lilith wanted to shake her head, but his hold on her jaw was firm. His cold gaze seemed a little less terrifying than the gaze that always danced with evil glints and malicious intentions. He slowly made her nod on his own. "Good girl," he rasped, and his cold expression instantly changed as that evil look came crashing back and rattled her whole existence as she shuddered in fear. His eyes traveled down to her lips and his gaze darkened. I fucking missed this. He rasped while caressing her lips with the pad of his thumb. She struggled and tried to push him away. Let me GMMFFPH. Before she could complete her words, he stuck his thumb inside her mouth, making her eyes go wide. Her hands lurched towards his as she tried to move his hand away from her jaw, but his movements only got more aggressive. With his free hand, he took both of her wrists and easily pinned them above her head, making her chest arch and brush against his. He deliberately moved down, pressing his chest against hers and putting his little weight on her. Lilith couldn't breathe. She was completely caged. She was helpless. No matter how much she tried to fight back, it was of no use against him. She was in a situation she never expected herself to be in 2 years ago. 2 years ago, she saw herself leading her people, helping her kingdom, and being an example and motivation for all those women out there. Not this. On the bed of a man who was not considered as a human. He wasn't even a human to begin with. How he easily held her down and felt her up to his liking. Her chest was completely pressed against his. His slight weight on her was enough to suffocate her as she fought to breathe, and his thumb in her mouth made it even more difficult for her. Her wrists were locked up, and she couldn't even struggle, let alone fight back. He stared at her vehemently with rugged breathing. Suck it, he said, shoving his thumb deeper into her mouth, making her slightly gag. Tears trickled down her temple as tried to struggle. Lilith felt how his fingernails kept digging into the soft skin of her cheek, but his thumbnail was not long. He could control his nails. I don't like repeating myself, little missy, he said, and pecked her on the cheek before sensually whispering in her ear. Do it before I force it, he said, and her eyes widened. Wasn't he already forcing it? What was his definition of forcing? She shut her eyes close and hesitantly gave his thumb a little suck. She flinched when he heard his rugged breathing, with a throaty chuckle right next to her ear. Such a small mouth, tighter is better. He rasped in her ear before taking her earlobe between his lips as he began to play with it. Lilith trembled as new and fresh tears pooled up in her eyes. Stop only when I tell you, he whispered in her ear and licked her earlobe, sucking on it. She gave another small suck on his thumb and shut her eyes. She tried to numb herself while she sucked on his thumb. This was torture for her. She couldn't endure it. She opened her eyes and side-glared at him with tears in her eyes before opening her mouth and harshly biting on his thumb. A groan left his lips, and then a second later, a painful gasp left her lips when he bit on her earlobe. Painful tears blurred her sight, but she didn't let his thumb go and bit harder on it. His breathing got even heavier as he moved back and stared down at her with raised brows and an amusing smirk dancing on his lips, making her instantly pause. He wasn't feeling any pain, but he did groan. But right now, he looks like he is enjoying it. That's all you got? He asked with his tilted head before finally pulling his thumb out of her mouth. He had a few tooth marks on his thumb, but he didn't bleed at all. Lilith coughed and took deep breaths while looking everywhere but at him. She tried to free her wrists from his hold, but it was useless. All of a sudden, he moved down, coming face to face with her. Her eyes widened as she stared at him with her throbbing orbs. You want it rough, huh? He asked. Chapter 20. You want it rough, huh? He asked, and her eyes flew wide. Before she could deny or do something in her protest, his lips found his way on hers, making her breath hitch. She started to move on the bed like a dying fish, but with his free hand he grabbed her waist and pinned it on the mattress while completely attaching his body against hers, making her unable to move as he kissed her. She instantly pursed her lips, but that didn't stop him, as he licked her pursed lips twice before moving down to her jaw. He planted open-mouthed kisses on her jaw, making her breathing irregular as she continued to struggle, even though she could barely move now. Let me go, she said breathlessly, as he continued to give open-mouthed kisses on her neck and jaw. Why you can't? She breathed down when he sucked on a particular area of her neck. Why not? He asked, taking her flesh within his lips and biting on it, making her flinch. He was deliberately leaving marks on her. She dreaded the moment he might sink his teeth inside her neck and drink her dry. I'm on my menstrual cycle," she let out with much difficulty, feeling extremely nauseated that now she has to tell him about her menstrual cycle just to get away from the hell that was coming her way. He paused and looked at her. "Oh, that I already know," he said, and she stilled. "Already know. The moment you stepped inside this castle, I've known since then," he declared rather proudly, and Lilith was left speechless, confused and terrified. "I'm a vampire. I can smell blood. What happened to your smart brain? Looks like Logon Kingdom has made you go dumb just like your so-called husband," he muttered casually. "For a vampire who has lived for so long, you sure blabber more than a teenage woman," Lilith thought while staring at him rather unenthusiastically. He could smell her menstrual blood. Lilith's eyes widened when she realized something. Sienna also. Does that mean she was also a vampire? Lilith was fast to put one and one together, and suddenly everything made sense. Sienna was here to seduce Jasper. He easily fall into the trap because he was a sucker for power and beauty. They killed those 5 people and planned all of this out, and it turned out exactly as they wanted. She stepped into this damned castle. She should have listened to her guts and fought her way to stay back. "Why you planned all of this?" Lilith asked. He slowly let go of her wrist and got straight. Her waist was caged within his thighs, but he was obviously not sitting on her. Lilith got on her elbow and stared at him in disbelief. Yeah, Ragnar was Alara, and he planned all of this. But why go to such lengths just to make her life more hell? Hasn't he done enough? Why was he even doing this with her? Yes, it was a plan, he mused with a shrug, and Lilith just stared at him in disbelief. She had so much to ask and say, but words wouldn't just form on her lips. Just a single word left her lips. Why? What has she even done to deserve this? If she has done something wrong to him, then she also deserves to know what she has done, because all her lifetime she have thrived to be nothing but a kind person. What have I done to you? She asked with a little teary eyes. He raised his hand and grabbed her chin. This face is your misery, he said ever so slowly, and she harshly pushed his hand away. Stop beating around the bush and just say it. What have I done to you? She asked, a deep frown on her face. Her swollen eyes were on the verge of shedding a few more tears of helplessness. He just stared at the hand she pushed away before slowly meeting her gaze. She scooted a little back. If this face is the cause of my misery, Lilith said, looking away while touching her face, I can burn it, slash it, would that free me? Before she could complete her sentence, he grabbed her hand and pulled it off of her face as he harshly yanked her forward with the hand he was holding her. What Lilith saw next was beyond her understanding. If I saw even a scratch on that face, I'll fuck everything all over for you, and there will be no mercy. He roared right on her face as she flinched back in horror. Her terrified eyes fixed on his. Her throbbing orbs fixed on his red ones. He looked like a bull, ready to tear her into two. She immediately pursed her lips, even stifling the whimper that unconsciously left her lips. This face of yours is the only reason you're alive, he declared, and yanked her forward once again. If he did that again, her arm would come off. What happened next left her baffled. He grabbed a fistful of her hair from behind and yanked her head back, exposing his neck to his red eyes, and the very next second she felt a sharp pain in her neck that made her eyes go wide, and before a scream could tore out of her lips, her mouth was covered with his other hand. She stared at the ceiling in terror, as her whole body jolted in pain. She felt like her neck would snap into two as he began to drink her blood. The way he sucked on her skin and drank her blood like a thirsty beast left her unable to move even an inch. Warm tears trickled down her eyes, her chest vibrated with each of her sobs that remained buried within her. He wasn't stopping. She tried to struggle out of his hold, but by now she was even weaker than before. She hit him on his chest once, and then twice as she began to feel dizzy. His hold tightened on her as he took one last sip of his heaven before pulling his fangs out and licking that area several times until the blood stopped coming out. He licked his blooded lips and looked at her only to find her unconscious. He put his hand at the back of her head as he removed his other hand from her mouth. He pulled her up on his lap and supported her back up with his hand on the back of her head. He slowly moved down and attached the left side of his face against her chest. Ba thump, ba thump. His red orbs stared at the wall in front of him blankly as he silently listened to her heartbeat. Good. Chapter 21. This face is your misery. His voice rang in her ears as a frown kissed her features. She kept shifting on something soft beneath her body while being completely drenched in sweat. Something blurry flashed in her vision. She couldn't exactly comprehend what it was, but all she saw was a village until that also faded away, and she found herself in a similar room from last night. Last night. Her eyes snapped open, and she abruptly sat up on the bed, huffing and puffing, trying to catch her breath as her terrified orbs dipped in horror stared at the wall in front of her. Her terrified eyes moved around the room, taking in her surroundings. The morning light was invading the room through the slit of the curtain. The surroundings were much more calmer as she found herself in her guest room. She ran a hand down her face and grabbed her head in her hands, staring down at her covered legs. Was all of that a nightmare? Yes, it was. Real as ever. The fatigue in her body was screaming the reality, yet she refused to believe it. She pulled out of the duvet and let her legs down the bed, but as soon as she got up, a sharp pain in her ankle had her sitting back on the bed with a yelp. She brought her ankle up and stared at it. It was bruised. Her heartbeat quickened instantly as all the night scenarios ran through her mind, leaving her with nothing but shivering as she touched her neck with her trembling hands. A certain area was throbbing in pain, and that was exactly where he bit her. She swallowed thickly and immediately grabbed the hand mirror from the side table, focusing it on her neck, and what she saw next made her gasp. Her neck and collarbone were filled with marks. Lilith forgot what exactly these were called, but she knew exactly what caused them, so she simply referred to them as kiss marks. She hesitantly caressed them, as small whimpers continued to escape her lips. All of that was real. Ragnar was Alara all this time. She stared at the mirror for the longest time, before harshly throwing it away, making it knock against the wall and fall in bits, shattering into nothingness. She looked at her bruised palms and feet. Even the dress she was wearing was all torn from down and ruined. Everything that happened was real. Her head was throbbing. Her ears were ringing, and she just couldn't think straight anymore. She was beyond terrified. She scooted back on the bed and hugged her knees closer to her chest as she nuzzled her face in her knees and began to cry. She didn't know what to do. Her fighting back wasn't helping at all. She knew she couldn't win from him, yet she refused to give in because she would never surrender. She pulled her face up and touched her wet cheeks. He said that her face was her misery, and that this face was also another reason that she was alive. She was not that beautiful. Something was wrong with him. No. Everything was wrong with him. Only a sadistic monster like him could make someone's life hell without any reason. He was doing all of this just for fun. Because he was bored. Lilith wiped her tears and stood up on her trembling legs. She limped up to the mirror and stared at her face in the mirror for the longest time. She had dark circles under her eyes. That gaze of hers was dead, and she resembled a dead person that went through misery, not the face that was saving her from misery. With a deep breath, she closed her eyes and tried to come up with ideas to get away from him. She could run, but if she did, she would be known as the runaway queen. Not that it matters, but Lagan's kingdom reputation would go down the lane, and their people would start bullying her people, and even worse, kick them out. She has lost the chance of her running away. How about turning everyone against Ragnar by exposing his true identity? No, Jasper would never believe it. He was already drooling like a dog for Sienna and the power he would gain after marrying her. Jasper has gone blind, he wouldn't trust her either. What could she do other than rebelling against that monster? Make him expose his true identity? But what could that do against him? He feared nothing, and she would be making things even worse for her and others. He was already ready for a war. There was really nothing she could do. While she was drowned in her thoughts, a knock on her door had her flinching as she snapped her head towards the door. Who? She asked. Queen Lilith, everyone seeks you at the lunch table. She heard a timid voice of a girl from behind the door, and she immediately understood who she was. It was the same young girl from yesterday that led her to the dinner hall. Luncle table. She skipped breakfast. Wait. She would have to face him. No, she couldn't. I'm feeling a little sick, please. Bring my lunch to my room, Lilith said loud enough for the girl to hear, and after a little pause, the girl finally answered. As you wish. With that said, she left. Lilith took a breath of relief and decided to have a quick bath in order to clean herself. With much difficulty, she cleaned herself up. The pain in her ankle was making it hard for her to stand properly. Once she was done, she wore her dress. It was a dark blue-colored dress with velvety clothing. Most of her dresses were simple and with less flow. Lilith couldn't manage dresses very well because she had never worn them on a regular basis before like she does now. She cleaned the floor and picked up all the pieces of broken glasses. Once done with that, she quickly dried her hair and covered her neck marks with a few cosmetics, and while she was doing this, a knock on the door had her jumping a little. She immediately put the things aside and settled down on the couch. Come in, she said a little too sternly in the act. The door was opened as the little girl stepped inside with the trolley of food. She closed the door behind her, bowed at Lilith, and started to put the dishes on the table in front of her. Lilith had no appetite, but she still made the little girl go through all the hustle. Why? She doesn't know. Once the girl was done, she bowed at Lilith again and was about to leave, but Lilith stopped her. Wait. The young girl paused on her steps and turned towards Lilith with her head low. Does the queen need anything else? She asked. I don't like eating alone, join me. Lilith mentally face-palmed herself for coming up with such a lame excuse. Why ask her to bring the food into the room when she couldn't eat alone? Her wide eyes snapped at Lilith as she looked at the queen in sheer surprise. I see it can't, she stammered. Her gaze flew down to the dishes before falling back on the carpet beneath her feet. Why not? Lilith asked. She could see the girl was hesitant, and somewhere terror could be seen residing in her little form and those big eyes of hers. Aren't you obligated to listen to me? Lilith asked, and the girl immediately nodded. Why, yes, I am. Then it's my order. Come and eat with me, Lilith said a little curtly, and the girl finally looked up at her. Their gazes matched, and Lilith passed her a little smile, patting the place beside her on the couch. She hesitantly walked up to her and settled down beside Lilith with a lot of distance between them. That wasn't the area Lilith was patting. Nevertheless, Lilith grabbed a plate and filled it with all the dishes before handing it to the girl. The girl slightly bowed at her, a meek thank you leaving her lips as she grabbed the plate from Lilith. Lilith quietly watched her, waiting for her to eat, but she was still like a statue. The girl side-eyed her innocently. Aren't you going to eat? She asked in a wavering voice, and Lilith instantly came out of her trance of thoughts. Oh yes, she said, and grabbed a plate for herself. Once she took a bite of her food, only then did the young girl start eating. She was waiting for Lilith to dig in first. Lilith felt a little at ease with the presence of this young girl with her. Although she was a maid of this haunted castle, still there was no negative energy radiating out of her. She looked like a victim herself. Lilith's eyes went towards her neck, and her pupils slightly dilated when she saw that her neck was covered with a cloth. She was hiding that mark on her neck. Why does she have it, and not the other maids? She wanted to ask about that mark, but if the girl covered it, then it only meant one thing. she was scared to talk about it, let alone wanting any outsider to notice it. Lilith quietly ate with her. "What is your name?" Lilith asked. The girl instantly paused and stared at Lilith with her big doe-like eyes. Both of her cheeks were puffed up because of the large quantity of food that was stuffed inside her mouth. She resembled a chipmunk. Ah ha ha ha. A low chuckle escaped Lilith's lips. The girl immediately swallowed the food down and shook her head at Lilith. "I don't know," she said, and all the smiles were wiped off of Lilith's lips. "You don't remember your name?" Lilith asked, and the girl shook her head again. "I don't have one." These words of hers were like an arrow striking right at Lilith's heart, and she felt the pain in her chest. A frown kissed Lilith's face as she put her hand on her chest, rubbing it. What was this? Why does a maid with no name affect her like this? No, was she about to have a heart attack? That was why she felt this pain. But it was for a mere second, yet so sharp that it shook her whole. Lilith cleared her throat and looked at her. She had dark black straight hair, big doe-like eyes with big black orbs. Her nose was small and her lips were thin. She was cute. "How about I give you a name?" Lilith asked, and the girl nodded at her. "Having a name from you is more than an honor," she said, and Lilith's smile widened. When was the last time someone really treated her like a princess or queen? 2 years ago. Of course, her own people. "Amaya," Lilith said. "Amaya means night run." "Then from now on, I shall be known as Amaya until death," Amaya said, and Lilith faintly smiled at her. "Have some more," Lilith said, and filled her plate with more food because she looked like she had been starving for years. Little did Lilith know, the bond she wanted to make with this young girl would prevail only with her disaster.
Want to win a free bundle of 3 amazing audiobooks? Comment Dark Fantasy below for a chance to win. No limit on entries. Comment as many times as you like. I will select 5 random comments. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for new books every weekend.
Chapter 22. The destiny wasn't repeating itself. It was a new beginning of a bitter end. Lilith was staring out of the window. Not to her surprise, the guards were scattered everywhere, guarding the castle as if a war were to break. She called her granny through Amaya and was currently waiting for her. She wanted to tell her about last night, but at the same time she was hesitant. In order to prove herself right, she would have to show her marks to her. The door to her room abruptly opened, and she turned around, thinking it was Granny, but to her surprise it was Jasper. He looked pissed. Ever since they got married, he dared pass her a little smile. His character took a huge turn. He locked the door and strode up to her while half yelling. "Why were you absent at the breakfast and lunch table? What is your problem?" he asked. "I was not feeling well, S." Before she could complete her sentence, he interrupted her like a bull who saw red. "Why the fuck are you always sick?" he gritted out, and she lowered her gaze for a good while before meeting his glare sternly. "You are acting like you've been putting a lot of effort into this relationship. Dare you come up to me and ask me why I wasn't at the breakfast table? Dare you to spare me a single lovely glance ever since we got married?" She let out, and he harshly grabbed her arm, yanking her to himself. All men knew was how to manhandle someone weaker than them. "Isn't it enough that I made someone like you my queen?" he asked, and her lips wobbled for a second there, but she immediately covered her expressions. "Couldn't be weak in front of someone weaker." "What do you mean by someone like me?" she asked, and harshly yanked her arm out of his hold. "As far as I know, you were the one who came to me for marriage," she said, and he scoffed. "I fucking regret it already," he said, and she shook her head at him. "You wouldn't be regretting if my land was still free. Your real objective was to stop me from going back to my land and marry me, so that you could have it under your power. You treated me nicely because you knew if you did, I would give you everything on my own. But once you got to know that the land was occupied by those blood-sucking monsters, you started to show your true colors. She said, a little hatred was radiating in her tone. Aren't you a fucking whore then? You married me, despite knowing that your land was occupied. So fucking selfish. He spat bitterly, and she was left speechless for a while there. She never expected such words to leave his mouth for her. She never expected him to speak in such a disgusting manner. Who could tell that he was the famous gentleman, King Jasper? All men were assholes. If she said that she did it for her people, he might kick her people out because he didn't get her land either. Did she really think for a second there that he could save her from that monster? He was nothing but one himself. Seems like she trapped herself in hell with no way out. She should have just run away that day. She thought she could share her misery with him, but instead of helping, he was giving her more misery. Yeah, the relationship built on greed brings nothing but downfall. Lilith passed him a look of disappointment. Just do what you're doing. Pretend like I don't exist, and focus on Sienna and her power. She said, and was about to walk away, but he grabbed her right wrist and harshly yanked her back in front of him once again. Are you saying that I'm a greedy dog? He asked, and she shook her head at him. Her gaze was blank. No, but if you think you are one, then who am I to say anything? She said, and he scoffed. He let go of her hand and stepped back, peering down at her with no expression. Lilith thought that he was done yelling, so she decided to just leave the room before him. But the very next moment, a sharp sound resonated in the room, followed by a thud. Lilith fell down on the floor while holding onto her left cheek. Her wide eyes stared at the floor in disbelief. Her sight went blurry due to the strong impact of the slap, and in no time tears were streaming down from the two pools of sorrow. He slapped her. Know your place and do what I say. If you didn't show up at the dinner table, remember this slap. He rasped. With that said, he turned around and left. She flinched when he harshly shut the door behind him. The sharp, stingy pain was burning her cheek as she lowered her hand and wiped her tears. She never thought things could go this way as well. She cursed the day she didn't run away. A sob raked her body, and she just couldn't control those honey jades to stop shedding the tears of overwhelming sorrow. The left side of her cheek was numb. She immediately stood up on her shaky legs and limped towards the door, locking it. She didn't want to see anyone anymore. She just wanted to be left alone. Her granny would only tell her to be patient, as if she was not patient enough to deal with that blood-sucking monster, without any reason that now she has to deal with another one. Shock, terror, sorrow, and frustration were building up inside her every day. She slid down against the door and kept wiping her wet cheeks to the point she was all swollen red, her left cheek standing out extraordinary. She was a mess. Granny came and knocked on the door, but Lilith told her to leave as she was sleeping. The old lady scolded her and told her to roam around the castle and interact with people. Roam around a haunted castle and interact with maybe blood-sucking monsters. She didn't even realize when the time flew by and the room fell into darkness. She just sat in the same spot all this time, staring into nothingness. A sudden knock on the door had her jolting up. My queen, it's me. Amaya. I'm here to take you to the dining hall, she said. Lilith's eyes widened and she immediately got up, wincing in pain when all her weight went on her sprained foot. What should she do? Jasper would kill her if she didn't go, but she was better off dead than to come face to face with that monster. Lilith, it's me, Sienna. I've come to personally escort you. Lilith's eyes widened even more. Wasn't Sienna Ragnar's sister? A vampire as well. If she was here, then that means Ragnar sent her here to bring Lilith. No way. She came here out of generosity when she didn't even visit her once the whole day. Lilith ran a hand down her face, the left side of her face twitching in pain. I'm coming, she said, and immediately limped towards the mirror. Concerned, kissing her swollen features. She was all swollen like a potato. She limped towards the washing room and washed her face. Are you coming? Sienna asked with a knock. Yes, I'm just changing, Lilith said a little breathlessly. Okay, take your time, Sienna said. Lilith immediately dried her face, being soft with her left side as she began to apply some cosmetics on her face to appear less swollen, but she just couldn't cover up her left cheek. She looked at herself in the mirror, and she was looking much better than before. She couldn't believe it. Hiding her bruises from the doers. But what else was she supposed to do? She had a reputation. No one would believe her anyway, even if she told them. She fixed her hair, leaving them open so she could cover her left cheek with them. She fixed her dress, and once she was done, she wore her shoes with much difficulty before limping up to the door. She stepped outside, only to be met by Sienna, who was patiently waiting for her. Amaya was nowhere in sight. I'm sorry, I kept you waiting. Lilith apologized, and Sienna shook her head at him. Lilith swallowed and looked away, trying to cover her left cheek with her hair when she found Sienna looking at her more intently than ever. Let's go, Sienna said, and they began to walk. Lilith tried her best not to limp, but she just couldn't walk elegantly either. Is everything okay with your foot? Sienna asked, as soon as she noticed it, acting like she wasn't aware that it was her brother's doing. It got sprained a little, Lilith said. Oh, I apologize. I didn't visit you today. I wasn't at the castle, but you should have asked for a physician, Sienna said, and Lilith shook her head. It's okay, it's nothing to fret about, she said with another thought in her mind. Sienna wasn't in the castle. Lilith thought negatively of her once again. This woman was clearly giving a clear path to Jasper, but Jasper was doing the same. Her negative surroundings have made her think extra negatively. Soon they reached the dining hall, and her heartbeat intensified when she saw him sitting on his master chair. His aura was darker than ever. Lilith swallowed thickly, trying to calm herself down. Once they reached the table, she pulled out the chair on which she sat last time, but Sienna grabbed that chair as well. Both the girls looked at each other in confusion. Aren't you supposed to sit with your husband? Sienna asked, and Lilith almost raised a brow at her. Weren't you sitting there yesterday? Lilith asked, and the atmosphere suddenly became hard to breathe in. Both the girls were silent as ever, until Sienna broke into an awkward laugh. I'm sorry, I didn't pay much attention to it, but it was an awful move from my side. Pardon me, I must have made you jealous, Sienna said, and Lilith passed her tight-lipped smile. Jealous? She doesn't care at all. No, it's all right, Lilith said. She didn't want to sit beside Jasper, but she had no other choice. She rounded the table and settled down beside Jasper. Her gaze flew towards Ragnar, and she almost flinched when she made eye contact with him. That man was staring right into her soul like a hawk. He was now bolder than ever, because Lilith knew who he was. His gaze had her hands trembling as she grabbed the fork. Jasper noticed how her hands were trembling as he smirked. A slap was enough to put you on the track, he whispered in her ear, and her hold tightened on the fork. Her gaze went dull. This man really thought he was the big deal here. His father was sitting right in front of him, from whom he was very much influenced. If he knew Ragnar's true reality, he wouldn't just tremble but might piss in his pants. Let's dig in, Ragnar said, and everyone began eating. Lilith began eating before he even said it. She wasn't feeling hungry, but she forced herself to at least consume a little food if she didn't want to diminish. Once she was done, she wiped her mouth and poured herself a little juice. Her eyes flew towards Ragnar, and he was still staring at her. He was staring at her all this time, but the amused look he first had in his eyes was replaced with something much darker. She swallowed and chugged down the water as if she was thirsty for days. She quietly sat there. Queen Lilith, now that you're done, shall we go to the garden? I bet you will like that place, Sienna said, and Lilith nodded at her. Both the girls stood up and left for the garden. He watched her back like a hawk, and once she disappeared from his sight, his dark gaze slowly turned towards Jasper. He grabbed the knife in front of him and stabbed it on the table a little too harshly, gaining Jasper's abrupt attention. What do you say? Shall we go on a hunt tomorrow? Ragnar asked, and Jasper agreed right away. Chapter 23. The sky was beautiful. The night fury that was covering the sky. The stars that were twinkling as bright as ever. All of this was soothing to her damaged soul. There was this vast garden at the back of the castle. It had different ancient stone statues planted at the four corners of the garden with a bunch of different flowers surrounding them. The grass was extremely soft against one's naked feet. Since Lilith couldn't walk properly, she was sitting on the bench beside Sienna. She had taken her shoes off, and her bare feet were resting on the soft grass. A peaceful sigh left her lips. She blocked her mind from all the thoughts and decided to cherish this peaceful moment for as long as it lasted. Are you sure you don't want to get your ankle checked? Sienna asked, and Lilith nodded, looking up at the sky. Her hazel hues dazzled like the night sky. Yes, I am sure, Lilith said. Ah, yes, brother might go on a hunt with King Jasper tomorrow. How about we also join them? Sienna asked excitedly, with a friendly smile on her face. Lilith passed her a polite yet tired smile. She didn't want to be anywhere near Ragnar. Before she could pass her the excuse of her sprained ankle, Sienna added in. I've heard that you liked hunting, and used to do it frequently back in your homeland, Sienna stated, and Lilith went utterly quiet. She knew about her past hobbies as well. She must have known them through her monster of a brother. Lilith slightly nodded. I used to, she declared, stressing the word used. Used to? No, I doubt that. Once you grab that bow, the desire to hunt will erupt on its own. Sienna said. She seemed to be insisting a lot. Of course she was selfish for her brother. She was on his side. She was also a blood-sucking monster. I will think about it, Lilith said, leaving the situation dangling. You better say yes. I want to go places with you, Sienna declared. Since when did they become so friendly? They sat there for a while before going back inside the castle. On their way to Lilith's guest room, both the girls came across the old granny. Once they reached Lilith's guest room, Sienna wished them a good night's sleep and walked away. With her brother around, Lilith could never have a good night's sleep. Lilith limped inside the room, followed by Granny. Granny immediately closed the door and hurried over to Lilith, blocking her way. Why are you limping? What happened to your cheek? She asked, her voice oozing with concern. Oh, I tripped in the restroom this morning, Lilith said, limping past Granny as she walked up to the dressing table. She looked at her left cheek. By now the swelling was even more prominent. The old granny strode up to her side. And what about your cheek? She asked, and Lilith sighed. Lilith has stepped back from telling everything to the old lady. She knew this old woman couldn't help her, but get even more concerned about her. She lost everything. This old lady here was the only one Lilith had. Troubling her so much wasn't a good plan. From now on, she will take things her own way like she used to. I told you I fell in the restroom. This happened because of that as well. That was why I was absent at the breakfast and lunch table, Granny. Stop worrying, Lilith said, and the old granny stared at her keenly, searching for any hesitation, but there was none. Did Jasper come to you? She asked, and Lilith nodded. Yes, he did. I don't understand why they separated the newly wedded couple. It doesn't make sense, and Jasper didn't do anything about it either, she said, and Lilith just quietly listened to her. They were separated for the better. Forget about it. Why don't you sleep here tonight? It gets really weird here in the middle of the night, Lilith said, turning to face the old lady. Just say you are scared, the old granny said in a teasing tone, and Lilith pinched her little nose, making her yelp as she lightly slapped Lilith's hand away. More like I missed you, Lilith said, and the granny shook her head at Lilith. Stop buttering me, she said, and Lilith huffed out. Lilith grabbed her hand and made her sit on the bed. I'm getting changed. Please sleep here tonight. It gets lonely, Lilith said in a meek tone, and the old granny squeezed her hands, immediately getting affected by it. Of course, I'll sleep here," she said, changing her tone as well, and Lilith passed her a smile before limping into the restroom. She got changed but didn't take off her makeover. If she did, the old granny would see all those sinful marks on her neck given to her by that monster. She limped out of the restroom, blew off a few candles, and locked everything while the old lady watched her actions keenly. Once done, she jumped on the bed beside the old lady. "Aha, are we going to sleep with the candles on?" Granny asked, and Lilith laid down on the bed, hugging the lady's waist while she was still sitting. "Yeah, I blew off most of them," Lilith said in a tired voice. "You know it's not good to leave the candles like this at night," the granny said in a scolding tone, and Lilith whined. "Come on, it's just a few. They will blow off on their own. Now lay down already." Lilith forced her down on the bed and hugged her. The old lady covered both of their bodies properly with the blanket. She was on the verge of tears. It has been so long since Lilith acted like this with her. Was the marriage finally working for her? However, she noticed how scared Lilith was, locking everything in a hustle. Maybe because Jasper wasn't with her. She was feeling happy about all of this, but she had her doubts as well. Lilith usually doesn't hide anything from her, so considering this, she must have been telling the truth about her injuries. "Good night, honey," the old granny said, and drifted off to sleep. Lilith was awake when the granny wished her good night. She was at ease because of the old lady's presence. This old granny has been with her ever since Lilith was born. Lilith has seen this old lady in her beautiful era as well. Though the granny appears stern with rules and ethics, she still cares for her. Lilith took a deep breath, and soon she drifted off to sleep as well. At night time, when the whole castle was asleep, when the corridors were indulged in darkness with not a single soul around, Lilith was peacefully sleeping beside her granny, dusting off all the exhaustion that was settled on every part of her bone. She was dozing off way deeper than ever, unable to feel the presence of the man right on top of her. Due to the dimly lit room, his huge shadow cascaded on either side of the wall. His long dark silver strands were falling down and were covering both of their faces from one side. She was on her right side, so her left cheek was right in front of his gaze. It had been so long since he had felt this immense surge of anger within him. How dare he touch his little Lilith? Ragnar's. His hands were in tight fists. His jaw was clenched, and specks of red could be seen taking over his gray hues. He swore. He didn't even move, and the girl was already staring up at him looking terrified as ever. While in her sleep, Lilith moved closer to the granny, but she felt something soft and silky touching the right side of her face. The more she became conscious of her surroundings, the more she felt colder, as a familiar scent invaded her nostrils and alerted her senses. It was a musky scent mixed with the scent of tobacco. Not soon after she realized this, she felt something. No, someone was touching her left cheek, and a zap of shiver ran down her spine, making her snap her eyes open. All the breath was knocked out of her system when she came face to face with the monster on top of her. Tonight was another nightmare for her.
To be continued. Book 2, Bride of Flame and Secrets is already available in my channel.